With Bartman Meets Radioactive Man and Bart and the Beanstalk out of the way, we're right in the middle of this forgotten wave of acclaimed Simpsons games. Times were changing, and while Acclaim kept making Simpsons games, none of them are as well remembered as the early titles, like The Simpsons Arcade or Bart vs. the Space Mutants. There were so many games released in 1991 and 1992 that were panned by critics and disliked by the people who played them, that by 1994, Simpsons games had fully established a negative reputation. People knew by this point that when a new Simpsons game came out, it was likely going to be bad. Now that we're in 1994, we've also fully moved on from the peak of popularity of The Simpsons themselves. The Simpsons would remain popular and well known as they continue to do to this very day, but the very early 90s was the height of Bartmania. After season 1, the viewing figures started to trend downwards for each season in the US. We're still talking about millions of people tuning in to watch The Simpsons every week, but the show went from a new original show putting a new spin and edge to the family sitcom to an established staple of TV comedy. Alongside the bad reputation of The Simpsons games and the show no longer being at its peak of popularity, 1994 was also a transitional time for video games. The SNES and the Mega Drive were heading towards the end of their life cycles after both consoles had built up a library of amazing games. The next leap for gaming was just around the corner, with 3D graphics starting to become a reality. 1994 saw the release of the PlayStation and Sega Saturn in Japan, and current consoles were doing what they could to try and emulate 3D graphics. This push towards 3D graphics also saw an increase in production values, which meant that the gap between licensed games and games from the big companies like Nintendo and Sega was starting to grow. On the NES, there were no AAA games. Even if licensed games typically weren't that great and were usually rushed out of the door, they still fit in alongside the other games on that console. On the SNES and Mega Drive, the divide was starting to become more obvious. Why would you play something like the Flintstones for the SNES when you could play Donkey Kong Country, with its use of 3D models that made it feel new and exciting? Even outside of graphics, while platformers were still popular, games were pushing the boundaries of their respective genres to create groundbreaking new experiences. In this environment, Acclaim's business model of rushing out Simpsons games was starting to make less sense. None of what I've just talked about stopped them from making more Simpsons games though, which takes us onto the topic of this video, Virtual Bart. Virtual Bart was released for the SNES in September 1994, with a Genesis port coming shortly afterwards. Sculptured Software, the developer behind Bart's Nightmare, returns for this one, giving us a pseudo-sequel to Bart's Nightmare. This would be the second and final Simpsons game that Sculptured Software would develop. This is before they were fully absorbed into Acclaim in 1995, which eventually led them to be shut down years later once Acclaim hit financial trouble in 2002. I'm glad to see Sculptured Software get another shot at The Simpsons. Bart's Nightmare had its problems with its controls and the quality of the minigames being inconsistent, but there was a lot to like. It managed to present its own interpretation of the show while still feeling very much like The Simpsons, and the structure of the game with its grade system meant it was fun learning the game and getting that A+. A version of Bart's Nightmare with better controls that also smoothed out the gameplay would really be something. The original designer for Bart's Nightmare, Bill Williams, had left the games industry by this point, but 14 people who worked on Bart's Nightmare returned for Virtual Bart, so the majority of the team remains intact. Virtual Bart launched in a difficult time for Simpsons games and licensed games in general, but the pieces are there for it to be a decent Simpsons game. If I had to put money on it, I'll say that probably didn't happen, but let's give it a go and find out for ourselves. Virtual Bart starts with a credit screen, the Acclaim logo with Baby Bart on top, a flashy Sculptured Software logo, and then the title screen, which has Virtual Bart written over and over again in the background, and a big Virtual Bart logo, with someone saying Virtual Bart.
Virtual Bart!
It doesn't stay on the title screen for long before going into demo mode. Selecting Start Game takes us into the opening cutscene, showing Bart walking through the school's science fair. Bart enters into a virtual reality experiment room where he finds himself strapped to a spinning machine with a VR headset on him in front of a crowd. Reading the manual for the game gives us a bit more information on what's happening. Martin Prince has created a virtual reality machine and is preparing to show it off at a science fair. Bart decides to sneak up on the machine to use it and ends up getting stuck inside. This somehow causes the machine to break, so now Bart has to complete the different VR programs in order to get out of the machine. This idea of Bart being stuck in virtual reality comes from the VR boom that happened in the late 80s and early 90s. In the early 2010s, we got a wave of different VR headsets released, which has led to virtual reality being a lot more accessible, and in some ways a bit more mundane nowadays. But it started to become a well-known idea in the late 80s. Different virtual reality devices were being developed, and some of these devices like virtual reality were available for the public to use. With this rise of virtual reality in tech, the film and entertainment industry started taking these ideas and running with them, like with the film The Lawnmower Man in 1992. As we are currently in the phase of Simpsons games where the ideas were running dry, it should be no surprise that Sculptured Software decided to jump on this trend for Virtual Bart. Virtual Bart is a minigame collection like Bart's Nightmare, but instead of reusing the idea of Bart being asleep and the minigames being dreams, we now have Bart stuck in a virtual reality machine where the minigames are different VR programs. The 90s VR aesthetic can be seen on the box art, with the blue grid trying to look 3D, and it can also be seen on the title screen, with Virtual Bart text being repeated and the big over-the-top logo using multiple colours. It doesn't quite stick the landing with recreating this look. It's not bad, but I wanted to feel more sci-fi and go all in with the weird visuals you got from media about VR. Some distorted backgrounds of strange mixes of different colours would help bring this all together. Virtual Bart fits into this 90s VR aesthetic, but it feels a little bit restrained overall. For the opening cutscene, this is the most impressive recreation of the show we've seen so far. The characters match the show, we have a location with the science fair which is the location we've seen Bart be in, and we even have decent jokes. As horrible as this sounds, the poor girl who's trying to do an experiment to try and bring a squirrel back to life while in tears made me laugh. I wish the cutscene was longer, and it obviously isn't one-to-one with the animation of the show, but it's the first time they've really properly recreated it in a game. Bart's House of Weirdness did a decent job, but it was mostly still images that weren't properly animated. And while The Simpsons Arcade looks fantastic, it's a much more stylized version of The Simpsons that feels like its own interpretation. Virtual Bart really feels like The Simpsons, and is making the most of being on a 16-bit console, which is great to see. When I looked at Bart's Nightmare, I started off that video by explaining my initial experience with the game, as it was the best way to convey how confusing and odd it was. With Virtual Bart being a sequel to Bart's Nightmare, I'm going to do that again as Virtual Bart is just as confusing. Okay, so with Bart spinning in the VR machine, I pressed a button which stopped him from spinning. This selected a minigame which took me into a cutscene showing Bart waiting in line for a water ride. This took me into a 3D style minigame. Bart started sliding down a giant pipe filled with water and I could press left and right to move to the sides. There were people and items that did damage and clocks to collect, but it was difficult to control. Bart would swing side to side without much precision, so dodging anything felt like luck. There were splits in the pipe where you could pick which way you wanted to go. With the loose controls, I wasn't really able to properly pick, but after going down a green pipe, I got shown a cutscene showing Bart being shot out of the pipe into a giant canyon. I'm assuming he died, but it was then back to Bart spinning on the machine to pick the next minigame. This time I landed on this dinosaur picture, which took me into a level where I was playing as a dinosaur, which is a raptor that has Bart's head attached to the top of it. I could jump and do a tail whip attack, which made an irritating whip sound every time. This was a side-scrolling platformer, although not a particularly fun one, as there's lots of different dinosaurs and rocks that come out of nowhere to do damage. There's also a caveman version of the Simpsons characters, like each of the Simpsons family, and other characters like Moe and Barney, and they all attack you. I died quite early on, but this minigame has multiple lives and checkpoints which allowed me to keep going. I managed to climb up a mountain on small platforms, went through a cave in that mountain, before climbing up the side of the mountain some more. All this happened while I was being hit by so much that was appearing on screen. Enemies took forever to die as well. I wasn't able to kill anything quickly. I eventually got to a section with a caveman Krusty the Clown where you have to jump on crumbling platforms. Maggie and Lisa appeared shortly after and they were able to kill me, leading to a cutscene showing a teacher looking at a Bart dinosaur skull. Going back to the spinning Bart screen, this time I landed on a bottle. This showed Bart as a baby being interested in an ice cream truck, taking us into gameplay which is another side-scrolling platformer. I was controlling baby Bart and I had to swing on branches to try and work my way across. I really struggled to control this. Bart has a very high jump, but I was stuck swinging as the main way to move and it was hard to land on the next branch, leading me to fall down and die. After getting knocked down by a bird, I died one last time finishing the minigame. I had run out of lives, which showed Bart coming off the VR machine feeling sick before going to the game over screen, ending my first attempt at playing Virtual Bart. It was a baffling start, but one that I was slightly prepared for, as I've already played Bart's Nightmare. Bart's Nightmare also was very hard at the beginning, and threw a lot of random events and minigames at the start. Virtual Bart does nothing to smooth out its opening moments, apart from maybe it's somewhat easier to understand, as you no longer have to deal with the windy world. It's just playing randomly selected minigames and focusing on beating those. I understand the basic with the 3 minigames I played, like how to control them, but I struggled to make much progress outside of the dinosaur one. It was disappointing that the minigames weren't easier than in Bart's Nightmare, and they were potentially even harder. It certainly didn't make me want to play more of this game, but there was definitely more to see, so I started a second attempt. This time I started with a Mad Max style game, where I was controlling Bart on a motorbike driving in a pseudo 3D level. After driving forward for a bit, the school bullies showed up and started attacking me. I couldn't figure out how to attack back, and there were random objects on the ground that I ran into, so I took a lot of damage. I did figure out how to kick, but that was too late and I died, showing Bart getting his arms stretched out by the bullies. The next minigame was another 3D one, where I was throwing tomatoes at other children outside of school. You press B to aim and then B again to throw a tomato where the line is. This was difficult to judge, as it's 2D trying to be 3D. I missed a lot, but I was able to hit a few of the kids, which caused a couple of adults to spawn. I aimed for Chief Wiggum and was able to hit him, but that ended the minigame. I failed and I was back to spinning Bart. The word I would use for when I was first playing this game would be disappointment. This approach to being weird and confusing at first didn't work for Bart's Nightmare, and it's simply disappointing to see Virtual Bart do the same thing. Any charm that Bart's Nightmare had with this is missing here. It's certainly strange and odd, but not in a way that's interesting. It's strange for its own sake. Every minigame I tried was difficult, and that simply isn't fun. I don't expect to be able to beat these minigames the first time I play them when the whole game is just a set of minigames, because burning through them would be boring, but I don't want the opening moments of a video game to feel like a slap to the face. There's not even a windy world to start learning about and explore. It's 3 random minigames that you have no chance of beating, and then a game over. I don't want to start off so negative right off the bat, but a sequel should feel like an improvement, a real step forward, and during my first 30 minutes with Virtual Bart, the game seemed worse overall. My next hour with the game was attempting more playthroughs, attempting to break through that difficulty wall that you get with older games, where you need to be patient in order to understand what's going on and eventually make progress. During this I was able to play the final minigame, which is this weird pig game where you play as Bart as a pig and have to escape a meat processing factory. I got stuck on this one jump that felt impossible to make, which caused me to lose all my lives. Outside of that, I managed to get further in the dinosaur minigame, completed the tomato throwing one, only for the game to throw a second level at me which I failed at, and I didn't really improve at any of the other minigames. I had spent an hour and a half with Virtual Bart, saw everything it had to offer, and had made no progress and had nothing to feel good about. At this stage, I decided to switch to practice mode. Rather than attempt full playthroughs, you can select practice mode from the title screen, which allows you to play any of the minigames you want as much as you like. This felt like the only way to be able to learn these minigames properly to beat them. As Virtual Bart is literally just 6 minigames, let's go through them all one by one, in the order that I focused on them in practice mode. The goal was to beat each minigame at least once in practice mode, before going back to try to beat the game properly. This process all started with the first minigame in the list, Dino Bart. Dino Bart starts showing off the Simpsons family as cavemen in prehistoric times, apart from Bart, who's a weird dinosaur hybrid creature. For Dino Bart's design, they took a dinosaur and added Bart's head from his model from Bart's Nightmare and called it a day. You're playing as a dinosaur version of Bart in a 2D side-scroller. You can jump, tail whip to attack, and use a growl attack. Growling acts as a screen nuke, killing all enemies on screen, but you need to pick up a growl item first before you can use it. The level design is quite vertical. There are lots of platforms you can jump on to climb up, and most areas require you to go upwards. Even the more horizontal areas usually have platforms to go higher or lower. Throughout the levels are different enemies, with a variety of different dinosaurs and even cavemen version of the Simpsons characters, such as Homer, Lisa, Maggie and Marge. There's even side characters like Moe, Barney and Krusty, and Smithers and Mr. Burns appear as mini-bosses. Side characters became a bigger part of the show throughout the earlier seasons, so now we're in 1994, it's nice to see the video games reflect this a bit. It's not just the Simpsons family, but a few other characters get the caveman treatment as well, which is cool to see. The Simpsons family themselves were changed quite a bit to look more like cavemen, which makes me sad for Moe and Barney, as they barely changed at all. I guess they more naturally fitted into the prehistoric vibe. It's a bit surprising to see a more traditional platformer as a minigame. Bart's Nightmare didn't have any platforming. The closest it got was in Windy World, but jumping there was only to avoid enemies, there wasn't much to it. As Dinobot is a platformer, it doesn't feel like they approached this like a typical minigame. This is a longer experience, and while it's technically one level, you're going through multiple areas with different aesthetics in order to get to the end. This is the first platforming that Sculptured Software has attempted for a Simpsons game, and as stupid as Bart looks as a dinosaur, it controls okay. Bart is quite snappy, with the movement, the tail whip and jumping feeling quick. There are issues with the controls, but we'll get to that in a bit. Early on I found progressing through the level a bit rough. It's easy to take damage, dinosaurs and cavemen will appear out of nowhere, and it doesn't give you a fair chance to take them out or avoid them. There are these green nippy ones that damage you and then quickly run away. You can jump on them, but it's not that reliable, and when there's more than one dinosaur on screen, they can quickly damage you by charging you over and over again. The bigger dinosaurs are just as bad. You're not really meant to kill them as they don't drop anything if you do and they have a lot of health. It's better to avoid them, but they're hard to jump over without taking damage, and they're placed in locations where you have very little choice but to run into them. This is something that occurs throughout the level. It's designed in a way where you either play the level the exact perfect way the designers intended, or you take damage from something. The cavemen are the worst enemies with how much health they have. Maggie, Homer and Marge all drop health when killed, and Lisa drops an extra life, so it's usually worth taking them out. The best way to do this is jumping on their head, which looks really dumb, with Bart bouncing on them over and over again and the camera bobbing up and down. It takes 16 bounces to kill Marge. This is simply tedious, 5 would have been more than enough. There's usually dragonflies that come to attack you as well while you're trying to do this, chipping away at your health. Homer takes 11 tail whips, which doesn't take any skill. It's waiting for him to run at you while attacking and waiting for him to die. Anyway, the first area ends with Barney blocking your path. The intended way to get past Barney is go collect a growl pickup and use it to instantly kill him. It's easy once you know how, but without the growl, Barney is a real pain. Attacking him isn't really an option as Barney burps at you, which does a lot of damage, and Barney, like the other enemies, takes way too many hits. You can try and run past him, but that's not consistent. Touching Barney hurts you, and taking damage can eat your inputs as well, so sometimes you can jump after taking damage, and sometimes you can't. Getting past Barney takes you into a cave, where Krusty the Cave Clown throws skulls at you. One nice thing this level does is refill your health after each section. The game also throws plenty of lives at you if you're willing to explore and have the patience to bounce on Lisa every time she appears. After taking care of Krusty and Marge in the cave, you start climbing upwards, avoiding boulders, dripping lava and jumping on crumbling platforms. There are a few sections like this in the level and they're all a bit annoying. It's mostly the boulders, they're needlessly difficult to avoid. They bounce right towards the platforms you can stand on, and jumping on them is rarely an option, as you can barely jump high enough to be able to land on them without taking damage yourself. The way they spawn in doesn't feel particularly fair, which is a running theme with Dinobot as a whole. You don't feel equipped to avoid obstacles. It's a case where Bart doesn't control badly, but the level design is very unforgiving, where it's so difficult not to take damage in any given section. After climbing up further in the cave, where Maggie is placed in a location where her bones are impossible to avoid, it's back outside for another mountain section. Dinobot hasn't been particularly fun so far, but this is where the level really takes a nosedive. You have to climb upwards, but this time every platform is a crumbly platform, so you have to jump off them quickly. The caveman version of The Simpsons appear again in this section, which gives you another chance to get more health and extra lives, if you can deal with the tedium of killing them all. Around here you'll start seeing blue boomerangs come from off screen, which are being thrown by Smithers. Smithers and Mr. Burns are the mini-boss, although you can kill them quickly using another growl attack. These boomerangs are really hard to avoid. Once you climb high enough, they just start appearing and they move too fast in order to dodge them. This area is a mix of boomerangs, crumbling platforms, a big dinosaur with lots of health, the Simpsons family throwing projectiles at you, and the dragonflies. Dealing with this all is frustrating. You're so big on screen and the level is starting to pile it on. Shortly afterwards, you have to jump across more crumbling platforms, and this is even worse. You first have Krusty throwing skulls at you and taking up space on platforms that you need to stand on, and then there's boulders that roll downwards at you, making them harder to avoid. You can't stand still in this section, as the platforms will disappear, and if you fall at this point, you either land in a pit or take enough fall damage to kill you. This platforming feels so bad. You have to deal with the frustrating of things coming at you all the time and doing damage, but now you can't even take your time, leading to even more pressure. Remember when I said taking damage can eat your inputs? Well, this is when it really becomes a problem. There's knockback when taking damage, but it doesn't happen consistently, so sometimes after getting hit you can jump again and sometimes you can't. As it's hard not to take damage due to the unfair nature of how everything is placed in the level, you're going to get hit, not jump, and then fall to your death. On top of all of this, there's slowdown during this. It becomes laggy at certain points when jumping across the crumbling platforms. This might be the real reason that the jump sometimes doesn't work, but it's hard to tell because this section is such a mess. I died so often trying to survive this. You get plenty of lives, but it hardly matters when you're dying over and over again in a way that feels cheap. It's actually quite short. Once you know where all the platforms are and can brace yourself for the horrible lagginess with the controls, it's doable, but it's a very unpleasant roadblock. Next up is back in the caves, which starts with another Barney burping at you. If you've saved one of your growls, you can take him out quickly, but jumping on his head isn't a bad option. After that, you're avoiding acid dripping down. You don't get much room to avoid these, and the acid drops will damage you after hitting the ground as it splashes for a bit. This leads to a lava pit, where you jump on different small round platforms to get across. It has that weird perspective where there are different planes all in the same 2D space, so there's 3 layers that have platforms on them and you have to jump between them, but sometimes when you jump between them, you'll land in the lava and die. If you're going to have platforming like this, at least don't make it an instant kill if you fall off. The platforms are small here, but there's nothing to cause damage and no slowdown, so the jumping is much more responsive, which makes this okay. At the end is a platform that goes up and down into the lava, which has a tight window to get across, which is followed by a platform that sinks when you jump on it. There's nothing visually to tell you that's the case, it just sinks and will kill you if you don't jump. It's decisions like these that makes the level design feel so horrible. There's no skill here, it's cheap deaths for their own sake. After the lava pit, you're going uphill avoiding acid boulders, and then there's another round of dodging dripping acid. I say you're avoiding acid boulders, but doing that is so hard. I ended up charging through and hoping for the best. There's bouncing boulders which you're meant to duck under, and rolling boulders to jump over. Jumping on the boulder should be simple, but you're going uphill. It's just physics. The boulder is higher than you, meaning you need to jump higher to clear it, leading to once again taking damage when you try and jump over them. If you're unsuccessful dodging a boulder, you've slowed yourself down and taken damage. As the boulders spawn constantly, you're lining yourself up to get hit a second time by slowing down. That's why I ended up running and hoping for the best. It's possible to sync it up to run under the bouncing boulders, but that requires a bit of luck. While trying to beat Dinobar, I did come across a different way of jumping. If you jump while holding up on the D-pad, you actually jump a little bit higher. It's not mentioned in the manual and not mentioned in the game, it's one of those things you just have to stumble across. This higher jump does help at times, I mostly used it when climbing up in the caves, but having to hold up when jumping can make things more tricky to control. It doesn't feel natural holding up when pressing jump. Normally in a platformer, you would hold the jump button for as high as you wanted to jump, and that would have been much better than switching between syncing up pressing up with the jump button while also going left and right. I prefer having this option to jump higher than not, even though it's easy to miss, it just could have been implemented a bit better. The end of the cave has a boss fight with Smithers and Mr. Burns returning. Smithers throws acid boulders at you, and Mr. Burns throws some normal ones, and you have to tail whip the normal boulders back at them. Once again, the boulders are hard to avoid in a fair way, so I found the best spot to hit back the boulders and mashed attack until they both died. 2 attacks destroy the boulders, and in the right spot you can attack Mr. Burns while stopping yourself from being hit. It's a terrible fight. It's not interesting attacking over and over, but you can beat them. With Smithers and Mr. Burns taken out, you can exit the cave, which takes you to a nice area. This was a depressing moment when playing. I didn't beat Smithers and Mr. Burns the first time, and there were so many difficult sections leading up to this, so finally getting here and beating this boss, I was sure this was the end. To have it not be the end, but also start a brand new section was so defeating. Not only that, but it's also an ice section, so you know what that means, slippery ice physics which makes you slide when moving. You won't be surprised to hear that the level doesn't improve. There are 2 Homer cavemen to deal with, and one of them is spawned at just the right moment to knock you off the platform. He spawns after you jump, meaning you have no chance to avoid him. They give you a growl at the start of this section, which is the best way to deal with Homer, but if you die, you lose that growl and then you're screwed. You can bait him down, but that's not a guarantee to take him out due to you slipping all over the place. It's nasty level design, something this level is littered with. After climbing up some crumbly ice platforms that have ice physics, which isn't as bad as it sounds actually, you're up high on a ledge. You have pterodactyls you can ride on, or you can drop down onto floating ice platforms. I ended up dropping down most times as I couldn't stay on top of the pterodactyls. The collision that lets you stand on their back isn't clear, and when they turn around they can throw you off. If you go for the ice platforms below, you are essentially blind jumping onto moving platforms that are over an instant death pit. There's enough platforms that you'll likely land on something, but not always. These ice platforms are similar to the lava pit, whereas different layers where the platforms can be. This time, more of the platforms move, they have ice physics, and you have to wait for platforms to appear from off screen. It's really awkward and hard figuring out the best way to go. It takes so little to end up in the icy water. Sometimes I found myself trying to jump onto a lower platform and ending up on a higher one because they're placed so close together and timed in the most awkward way they could think of. This section was another roadblock, so many deaths trying to make these jumps. Eventually you jump onto dry land, only to ride onto another ice platform that takes you to a big block of ice. I couldn't figure out what to do. There's nowhere to go to the right, and there's a platform that appears below you, but I didn't know how to reach it. The solution is that you need to hold down on the D-pad and press jump to drop downwards onto the lower ice platform. If you time this properly, you'll land on the platform below. It's amazing how many awful and vindictive level design is on display here. This is the only time this move is required in the entire game, and guess what? It's not mentioned in the manual that you can do this, and it's never mentioned in the game. It's a fairly common move for a platformer to have, so there's nothing wrong with having this move in the game, but why require it here, so late on in the level, when you're on a huge chunk of ice that doesn't look like you'll be able to drop through it, and if you get this wrong, it kills you. Anyway, after another round of tricky jumps on slippy moving platforms over instant death water, snowballs start appearing out of nowhere. These can hit you quite easily, and the knockback will push you into the water and kill you. It's more cheapness, more awfulness, and you have so little room to avoid these because they come from off screen. The best tactic is to jump up and down on the spot and hope that the snowballs aim for you while you're up in the air rather than when you're on the ground. The snowballs keep coming until you come to an ice platform that is going back and forth between Caveman Moe and Caveman Homer. They're throwing snowballs at you, which you have to try and avoid while tail whipping them back. You're trying to knock off all the sheets of ice they have so you can whip them directly. After everything it takes to get to this point, this section is tragic. You can't jump to avoid the snowballs, as it's so difficult to jump upwards with correct timing to then correctly land back onto this slippy moving platform. This also means it's very hard to jump up and attack Moe and Homer while landing back down safely. I did figure out a tactic here after many depressing, heartbreaking deaths. I stayed on the platform, moved to the side of the platform and kept attacking. These would take out some of the snowballs and if I was lucky, hit Moe and Homer. When coming back the other way, I would move slightly to the other side of the platform and start attacking again. Similar to the Smithers and Mr. Burns fight, it seems like they created this setup to make a more dynamic boss, but avoiding projectiles is such a pain, so the best strategy is to move very little and attack to protect yourself. Using this tactic I was able to win, and defeating Moe and Homer is finally the end of the minigame. I picked Dino Bar as the first minigame to complete, as it's the first in the list of all the minigames and I'd already played it a decent amount, but I had no idea how much pain I was in for. So many times I reached a section that was overly difficult and frustrating, and after I figured out a way to get past it, another just as terrible section was waiting around the corner. You know how the Simpsons game had video game cliches as a collectible, meaning they intentionally added in cliches to the game, meaning it was full of them? This level feels like someone did the same thing for bad platforming games, only without doing it as a joke. It features so many issues that you find with bad games, and it's all crammed into one level. This is a list of everything that's wrong with this level. I would normally explain each of them, but there's so many that I can't do it. It mostly boils down to the level design. It jumps between annoying parts where you're always taking damage, to dodgy platforming where one mistake means you're falling into an instant kill pit. It took me over 3 hours to complete this minigame. So many deaths, so much misery. My successful run was 18 minutes long. It's one minigame that you're completing as part of a set of minigames, and it takes so long to do. Even in actual platformers, in 18 minutes you could beat so many levels and make so much progress even in ones that are difficult. To have one self-contained level be this long and have it be this awful, it's shamefully bad. Without a doubt, this is going into the Simpsons video game Hall of Shame. It's one of the worst levels in any Simpsons game. It might control better than other Simpsons games, but it doesn't matter when the level design is this dire. It's not a good sign the first minigame in Virtual Bart is this bad, but this should mean that things can only get better from here. We see Bart smiling in his room after seeing that it's class photo day. The game starts with Bart hiding behind a mailbox, aiming tomatoes at other kids at school. The goal is to throw tomatoes at each of the children, as Bart is trying to ruin the class photo by covering everyone in tomatoes. This minigame is fake 3D. We're on the SNES, so it's using Mode 7 style 2D graphics to fake 3D. You press B to start a throw and the yellow line goes forward. When you press B again, you throw a tomato wherever the yellow line ends up. I like the setup and look of this minigame. This is a much simpler idea. It's Bart being a troublemaker by throwing tomatoes at other kids. It's set outside Springfield Elementary, so it's actually set in Springfield, and it's recreating a location from the show. It seems like they're taking inspiration from the season 4 episode Duffless, where Bart throws a giant tomato at Skinner. We also have a range of recognizable characters. Dinobart did this too with the different cavemen, and now we have different kids from the show. After hitting a few kids, adults start appearing as well, so we get more characters like Chief Wiggum and Groundskeeper Willie. Seeing all these characters is one of the best things about Virtual Bart. It's something that was missing with games like Bart and the Beanstalk and Bartman Meets Radioactive Man. For the gameplay, it's tough at first as you don't get a proper sense of depth. This minigame is all about timing, but it takes some time to get a feel for how long it takes for a tomato to travel and how far away the kids actually are. The yellow line does show where you're going to throw, but it doesn't feel that accurate. When I first played this, I was only throwing tomatoes down the middle, but it turns out you can hold left and right to throw diagonally as well, although you can only throw to very specific points. After learning this and a bit of practice, this minigame started to become fun. It's surprisingly satisfying landing those diagonal shots, to have everything line up perfectly and to nail the timing when throwing a tomato. It's a minigame that takes some time to get used to, but when things click, it's quite good. There's also a slight homing property to the tomatoes, so you need to be precise, but the game will land sometimes when you're a little bit off, so you don't need to be perfect. You have 130 seconds to complete this, so it's nice and to the point. You throw tomatoes, and if you hit all the kids, you're done. As a simple minigame, it takes time to figure out, but is fun when you do it, and has great presentation. There's a scene at the end that shows the class photo as well, with tomatoes splattered on every kid you hit, which is a nice touch. Bart poses differently here depending on how well or how poorly you did, which is another nice detail. The second part of this minigame has you throwing eggs at the kids on the school playground. The eggs aren't any different to the tomatoes, so control-wise, nothing changes. The visuals are a bit different and there's a different song playing. The music in this egg level sounds like you've stepped into a cave in Banjo-Tooie. What changes gameplay-wise is the way the kids move. In the first level, they go back and forth in a straight horizontal line at different speeds. The further away the kids were, the harder they were to hit and timing was harder to judge. They all stayed on one plane going back and forth, meaning you could get a sense of their depth and then focus on timing your shots when they were walking either to the middle, left or right. In the egg throwing level, the kids now move in any direction. They still go left to right, but they will go towards you and further away. When they go backwards and forwards is somewhat random. It makes timing your throws so much harder. You have to try to tell if they're moving away from you or not by going by how many pixels the character has, and then hope that they don't change direction by the time you aim and throw an egg. It feels like there are times you line it all up perfectly and they change direction at the exact right time to dodge your egg. As kids move at different speeds, the faster kids have such tiny windows for you to hit them, and timing that while guessing how they're going to move feels too luck based. It's still all about correct timing and you improve with practice, but I never enjoyed this level. Sometimes I could hit several kids with eggs easily, sometimes I'm missing every single shot. There's a limit to how many eggs you can throw. If you run out, then that counts as you failing. I don't think the egg limit is too bad, as it forces you to take your time when throwing, which is needed to beat this, but having both a time limit and an egg limit feels too harsh considering the difficulty of this minigame. It got to the point where I was able to beat the tomato level every single time, and that remained quite enjoyable. I couldn't get past the egg level. I got close a few times, but would either run out of time or hit one of the adults, which is an instant fail. The small windows you get to land your shot and trying to correctly judge where those windows will appear felt too unreasonable. The 3D effect doesn't work well enough where you can judge depth well enough to push the difficulty this high. When you miss your egg because the kid changes direction as soon as they step into the point on the playground where you can hit them, that's a horrible feeling. I'm also pretty sure that you can throw your eggs further than the kids will ever go. Whenever I went for the furthest shots, they would usually sail over the kids' heads, which is in part due to my bad timing, but it feels like you shouldn't be able to throw that far in the first place. This minigame took another 3 hours to beat. I think it's better than Dino Bar, as it's much shorter so not as tedious, but it became very defeating losing the egg game over and over again. I was so glad when I was finally done and could move on. The presentation and idea is still solid and there was potential here, but the difficulty of the egg level brings it down. I don't think it deserves to go in the Simpsons Video Game Hall of Shame at least, so that's something. We start with a cutscene showing Baby Bart with a younger Homer with hair. Bart sees an ice cream truck taking us into the minigame. You control Baby Bart. It's kind of a platformer, with this first section focused on swinging on branches on trees. The minigames in Virtual Bart are split into 2 categories. 3 of them are platforming levels, which are overly long, and the other 3 are short minigames which try and emulate 3D. I'm jumping back and forth between the platforming levels and the 3D minigames to try and maintain my sanity when playing this game. Baby Bart starts with you swinging through trees. This section is focused on swinging on different branches and launching yourself onto the next branch to get across. There's a few places you can stand, but it's mostly swinging. This is pretty tricky to figure out how the swinging works. The swinging appears to be pretty simple. You press jump at the right time in order to launch yourself further, and that matches up to what you would expect. Press jump on Baby Bart's upward swing and you'll go higher. The issue is controlling yourself to make sure you reach the next branch. Both when you jump and swing, you can go very high in the air, but you can't go as far to the left or right as you would want to. When I was first playing this, I would time my swing and then try to aim myself using the D-pad to land on the next branch. This resulted in a lot of times when I would miss, or slightly clip into a platform, and because platforms are tiny and I wasn't expecting to do that, I would instantly walk off the platform as I was still pressing left or right. If you fall off the branches and land on the ground, it counts as a death and you lose a life, so any hiccups with missing branches or clipping into platforms means you're starting the level again. As most mistakes mean you die, I actually couldn't get past these trees. After enough attempts, I was able to figure out where I was going wrong. When you're launching yourself after swinging, Bart will auto aim to a specific branch. After you let go, Bart picks a branch and he'll automatically position himself to grab another branch. If you've got enough height from your swing, he will go towards it without needing you to move at all. The best way to get past this section is to start trusting this auto aim. When I was pressing the D-pad on every single swing, I was fighting against the auto aim, which made reaching branches more difficult. Now, that doesn't mean you should never touch the D-pad, because you will need to readjust Bart sometimes as the auto aim isn't great. It's fine for climbing up a tree, but not jumping to the next tree. The auto-aim can also be a bit unpredictable at first. It can make you go for branches that you might not be expecting, like rather than going to one close by, it can launch you further sometimes and just miss. With a bit of practice dealing with the auto-aim, this section can be beaten quite easily, but it's conceptually awful and never controls well. It's hard to really know at what point this was supposed to be fun, when you're tediously swinging over and over again and having to make this uneasy peace with the auto-aim. It also doesn't help that you need to set up the direction that you're swinging, as that changes the direction the auto-aim will take you. So if you're swinging anti-clockwise on a branch but want to go to the right, you'll need to start swinging clockwise first. To do this though, you have to hold left, not just press it, but hold, in order to spin the correct way to go to the right. I didn't enjoy this at first because I kept dying, and when I figured it out, it was great in order to beat it, but the control quirks and how lame this idea is stopped me from ever enjoying it. The awful music doesn't help things either. As you're playing as a baby version of Bart, they made this song that sounds like a lullaby, and it's way too short and repetitive for a level that is this hard. It makes the process of beating this level even more maddening hearing this tune over and over again. At the end of the trees, you have to swing up to the top branches of the last tree in order to jump onto a washing line. I kept failing to do this and was bounced back onto the trees as I couldn't go far enough to make the jump. It was while I was playing Baby Bart when a certain item I ordered arrived at my house. Back in 1995, an official strategy guide was released for Virtual Bart, the first Simpsons game to receive its own official guide. The strategy guide was written by Steve Schwartz, an author who wrote several video game guides, as well as multiple guides for Microsoft Office and other software for Windows and Mac. Anyway, he was able to get the rights for the Virtual Bart strategy game he wrote back in the 90s and republished it as recently as 2019. I purchased a copy of the 2019 version, which is a bit surreal to see it's a real thing. The first thing that stands out about it is its cover. It doesn't have the original cover, and it doesn't even have any Simpsons on the front. Instead, it's using a stock photo. This photo is from the Indian city Mumbai, showing the Grant Road Skywalk. You can find the full version of this photo online, and I found a report called A Snapshot of the Indian Clean Tech Financing Ecosystem that used this image as well. I get that they might not have been able to use Simpsons artwork for the new version of the guide, but a stock image showing VR or something would have fit a bit better. It's a bit crazy they picked a photo from Mumbai of this cover, which has nothing to do with the original game. For the guide itself, it's not too bad. It gives you specific tips for the SNES and the Genesis based on the differences that each of those versions have, which is nice. I like the level maps as well. It's nice to see the full layouts of each of these sections. The main problem with the guide is that it's lacking real advice for the harder sections of the game. For the egg throwing minigame as an example, it suggests that if you're missing your shots, to just throw into a crowd and hope you land your hits. This is advice that will likely cause you to run out of eggs, or hit one of the adults and instantly fail. For Dino Bart, it also doesn't cover the whole level. It cuts out half the ice section, and doesn't talk about defeating Moe and Homer at the end at all. I still appreciate this guide existing though. Is it a piece of media that really deserved to be brought back? Probably not, but that's what makes it cool that someone republished it anyway. The guide also mentions how originally they wanted to make a guide for every Simpsons game, but due to long negotiations between the publisher and 20th Century Fox over the use of Simpsons characters, they ended up only covering Virtual Bart, as the older games were no longer relevant. Back to Baby Bart, and the guide mentions about how looking up how to use the parachute in the manual. Not sure why the guide couldn't just tell you, but looking in the manual, it says that you can use the diaper chute to slow your fall by pressing X. This is how you get from the trees to the washing line. The diaper chute doesn't give you much more time in the air as it doesn't last that long, but it gives you enough time to make this jump. The washing line is an auto-scroller, where you have to walk along each of the lines, avoiding the clothes attached to the lines as they knock you off. You can jump between the three lines to avoid clothes, and shoot your pacifier to take out objects like paper planes and frisbees, as well as squirrels and cats. If you're not careful, this section can drain your health very quickly. Most of what appears on screen appears too quickly in order to react to it to take it out without getting hurt, so it's more about finding the best washing line to stand on to stay out of the way of the planes and frisbees, which mostly means any line but the top one, while you're firing your pacifier often to try and take things out as quickly as possible. The pacifier takes everything out in one, but has a very slow fire rate and can only be fired in 8 directions. It creates situations where something is near you, but you can't do anything about it, either because it's at an angle that you simply can't fire at, or they move in a way that's too awkward to properly track. The washing line went one of 2 ways whenever I played it. It either went very well, I could guess correctly and take out the frisbees before they came on screen, while also dodging the enemies and could get to the end with most of my health. It could also go very badly, where I'd miss with the pacifier and frisbees and squirrels would hurt me multiple times in a row, as there's little you can do once they get close, and I would be nearly dead by the time I got to the end. It's easy to get past this section, but the only way to be good at it is either be insanely precise with the pacifier, or memorize where everything comes from to come up with a perfect route. Neither of these options sound that feasible to me, so I fumbled through it and was able to do okay most of the time. At the end of the washing line, you find a set of balloons and you jump on top of them to ride them while hanging onto the strings. You can climb up and down, and even jump off for an extra life at one point, while dodging paper planes and frisbees alongside these now jumping dogs. Like the washing line, there's too many things that come off screen too fast that will chip away at your health. Some of the dogs here can be avoided by climbing upwards, but others will hit you every time. It means you need to hit them with the pacifier before you reach them, and it takes 2 pacifier hits to get rid of a single dog. This is doable, but it's very awkward shooting the pacifier. You have to press down and right at the same time as you press B to shoot the pacifier at the right angle, and you need to time this with where the balloons are and how high up you are on the balloon strings. It feels pretty unreasonable the ways they expect you to use the pacifier. They do give you a health pickup during this part, so as long as you grab that, you can get past this section without taking out any of the animals that attack you. So far this level hasn't been good, and it's definitely overly irritating figuring out how to beat each section, due to the poor controls and unfair enemy spawning, but with a bit of practice, these first sections are all very beatable. Next up, it's a race in a pram against a Kearney baby, and I think the other one's meant to be Jimbo. For such a minor character in the show, Kearney sure is used a lot as an inspiration for characters in the Simpsons video games. For this part of the level, you can go between 4 lanes by pressing up and down, and you can change your speed by pressing left and right. You automatically go forward, and the goal is to get to the end without overturning your pram. There are obstacles to avoid, with some doing a bit of damage, and others like the fence on the ground killing you in one. Just like every part of this level, it's annoying at first until you figure out how to beat it. There are 4 lanes, but it's better to stick to just a couple of them and jump between those. It's also much better to slow yourself down, so you have much more time to react to what's coming. If you treat this like an actual race and go fast, it's easy to hit something and instantly fail. It's presented as a race, and you should go fast if you can, but it isn't actually a race at all, so it's easier to just take your time. This pram race thing is okay. It would have been a lot better if there weren't so many obstacles that would kill you outright. It feels like half of them do, which feels unnecessary. Stepping back for a second, one of the big problems with Baby Bart is that it never really feels fun. At best it's tolerable, and part of the reason for that is because it switches gameplay styles so often. During a typical playthrough of Baby Bart, getting to the end of the pram race would take about 4 minutes. So that's 4 different gameplay sections within 4 minutes. It's too much for what is one level inside of a larger minigame collection. We still have more of this level to go, but even at this point in the level, it's clear that they tried to do too much for Baby Bart. Where Dino Bart was very similar platforming stretched out over a level that was far too long, Baby Bart is more condensed, and they try to frequently mix up the gameplay, making it messy and confusing in its own way. It's more ambitious, but they try to do too much and simply couldn't pull it off. So after the pram race is our 5th gameplay section, where it's more pure platforming, where you have to jump on these balls that are being pushed up and down by seals. Missing any of these jumps is a death, and if you stay on a ball for too long, that also counts as a death. Out of nowhere, for a level that hasn't really been about traditional platforming, they throw at you one of the hardest and strictest platforming in the entire game. It might even be one of the hardest platforming sections on the SNES, honestly. You have to be near perfect with your timing in order to get past this, and it's almost impossible to beat on your first time when reaching this point. Okay, so the seals each have their own timing of going up and down, and there are different size gaps between each of the seals. For the first 4 seals, it's very easy to get across by just jumping as you naturally would. The jumping feels very restrictive because you don't go that far left or right, but you can make these jumps. The jump to the 5th one though has insanely tight timing. You have to wait until the last millisecond to jump over the 4th one and then hope you timed it right so the 5th board is just starting to appear in order for you to land on top of it. It's split-second timing to make this, and the worst part about it is that the timing isn't consistent. When you get across the first 4 seals, sometimes the timing will be correct for you to make it, sometimes it's impossible, and all you can do is jump back and forth between the 3rd and 4th seals and hope that the jump becomes possible somehow. The reason you have to do this is because the seals aren't in sync. They are at slightly different speeds, which means the timing changes depending on how they happen to sync up. The syncing between the 4th and the 5th seal can sometimes get synced in a way to make it even harder, and there's nothing you can really do about that. This jump is the hardest one, but it's still difficult after you reach the 5th seal. Some jumps are simple, but there are times when the jump won't be possible. The windows of each of this jump is very tight, and you have to make split-second decisions to whether you should go for it or jump back to a previous seal and hope for the best. It takes a lot of quick decision making to get past all of this, with one wrong decision or slight delay in your decision causing you to die, which means starting from the first seal again. Difficult platforming is not bad to have in a game. Well, in a minigame collection based on The Simpsons is quite bad, but in a vacuum this could have been fine. There's 2 reasons this is completely unreasonable. The first is the timing of the seals that I mentioned. The fact that they can go out of sync is really rough. You can't just learn the timing of this section, which would already be quite difficult because you can barely do these jumps due to Bart being very stiff when jumping left and right, but because of the desync between the platforms, the timing changes. It's more about learning what jumps can screw you over and being able to recognize situations where this can happen and being ready to jump back to give yourself a chance. The second thing that drags this down is the lack of lives. You start this level with 2 lives, and if you grab every life and don't die, you can have 6 lives by the time you reach the seals. That's pretty hard to do in itself, and even with practice I usually lost at least 1 life before this point. 6 lives sounds like a lot, but you burn through them so quickly as any little mistake is a death. With how fast this all moves and how little time you have to perform the correct jumps, 6 lives isn't enough. There's a lot to learn and understand about how it works, but this game doesn't give you enough tries to do that. By the time you might start getting the hang of things on one run, you've run out of lives and have to start the level from the beginning. You then have to play the previous 4 sections to get another chance at this, which somewhat resets what you have learned before. Lives and game overs are there to punish the player, and should make progression more satisfying, but for Baby Bart, it makes understanding what to do far too difficult. I'm not saying you can't figure this out, but the process of playing it over and over again and just trying to figure out what's going on with these seals completely undercuts that satisfying feeling because it's so difficult and brutal. You needed more lives here, which is strange because Dinobart was more generous with its lives, which did make figuring out its more difficult sections more doable, despite those sections remaining awful. It was during this time playing Baby Bart that Virtual Bart started to break me. After playing through Dinobart and the egg throwing minigame in Virtual Class Picture, I really needed some relief. Something to play in this game that was at least okay. I got stuck playing this same level over and over, playing the same tedious and annoying sections just for a chance at the seal platforming, which burnt through all my lives very quickly and didn't make me come any closer to figuring out what I needed to do. Playing Virtual Bart would put me in a bit of a bad mood. I could only play it for an hour at a time, as any more than that was too enraging or was just too defeating. It was finally time to use a save state. It felt like it was the only way I was going to figure out how to get past the seals, as I could keep reloading it and throwing at myself over and over again to start piecing together the best route. In case you're wondering, no, the strategy guide isn't much help, unless you find advice like timing your jumps is critical to be that useful. Eventually I was able to beat it. It really comes down to 2 or 3 jumps that you need to be ready for, and also a bit of luck with how the seals sync up. It's so twisted someone designed this level this way, and thought a platforming section like this was appropriate. It adds to that feeling that Virtual Bart wasn't playtested properly, or the developers were completely disconnected from what a fair, fun challenge in a video game looks like. At the end of this, you jump onto a trampoline and find yourself in a circus tent. That's the reason why there were seals before, because now this level is all about the circus. This is the last part of the level, where you have to swing upwards while dodging clowns, swinging across large gaps, and jumping on trampolines through hoops. This is easier than the seal platforming, but I was so mentally exhausted I ended up hating this whole section. You're using the swinging again like with the trees, but have less room and options to climb upwards. There are clowns to avoid. The clowns don't do damage, but what they're juggling does. Kindly, they don't throw them at you when you're swinging and preparing to jump, but as soon as you go, they start throwing things at you, which can knock you back and can cause you to die. Like with so many sections before it, you can either quickly shoot upwards and get past it no problem, or get hit multiple times and take lots of damage. It's in part due to how accurate the clowns feel like being, and in part due to how the auto-aim with the swinging feels like working. You can swing at slightly different angles on the horizontal poles, which changes where Bart goes, and you have to hope to swing at the correct angle to launch yourself upwards to the correct pole. It's trying to make the swinging more difficult by giving you less freedom, which only exposes how weird these controls are. Bouncing on the trampolines for the most part is okay. It's a bit more lenient with the jumps you need to make between each one, and it is quite cool jumping through these hoops. Apart from when there's 2 in the row, I have no clue how you're meant to not take damage from the second one. The toughest part of the circle is swinging on the trapezes. You have to jump from one to the other as they swing, and time your jumps to grab onto the next one. That sounds okay, but like the rest of the level, it's needlessly difficult. You have to jump right onto the small circle as it swings towards you, and with how small that circle is, it's very easy to miss and lose a life. You're also trying to time this while the trapeze you're trying to jump to spends most of its time off screen. You have to guess when it's going to appear back on screen to jump at it, but like the seals before this, the trapezes aren't in sync. It means the timing changes as you wait. The entire circus is much easier than the seal section from before, but it's too easy to mess up here when you've already gone through so much to get to this point. Baby Bart ends with one last section where you have to bounce off trampolines to get past clowns that are bouncing up and down. This might be one of the most reasonable parts in the whole level. It's all about bouncing up and down and waiting for the correct time to jump and float across to the next one. I actually have nothing to complain about here. It's just a shame you have to go through so much to get to this point. With one last jump of a trampoline, you land inside a cannon, ending off the level. I had to use save states once I got to the seal bit, but once I did beat this level for the first time, I did attempt to beat it all in one run without using any save states. I wasn't able to do so. The seal balls always caused me to get a game over, and by this point I was completely burnt out by this level. Baby Bart tries to create a platforming level with lots of variety, but it falls apart due to the controls and difficulty balancing. It's shorter than Dino Bar, but is relentless with how punishing it can be. Even when there are parts which aren't as hard, it never comes across any ideas that are fun. Swinging lacks decent controls, the washing line throws stuff at you from off screen, the balloon forces you to use the pacifier which is awkward to aim, the pram race is filled with instant kill obstacles everywhere, the seals have insanely tight timing with its platforming that can be impossible due to bad luck, and the circus has the bad swing controls again and awful jumps between the trapezes. It doesn't even give you as many lives as Dino Bar, which makes it harder to finish. For the seal platforming alone, it's going in the Simpsons video game Hall of Shame. I almost recommend giving it a go to see how unfair it feels. It's the hardest platforming section in any Simpsons video game so far, and I don't see that ever being topped. Well, there's 3 more minigames to go in Virtual Bart, so never say never. It's back to another Mode 7 minigame, this time having Bart queuing up for Mount Splashmore. This game takes place inside the water ride from Mount Splashmore, as Bart tries to ride down to the bottom. You have to avoid other people, and sometimes sharks, to stay alive. As you go down, you're given a choice between 2 pipes, and you have to pick the correct one to continue going down. If you pick the wrong one, you're greeted by Homer stuck in the pipe, and are pushed back to go down the right pipe. If you go down the wrong pipe 3 times, that's a game over. There's no lives. If you lose all your health or go down the wrong pipe too many times, the minigame ends. I haven't talked about this yet, but Virtual Bart has the most voice acting of any Simpsons game apart from The Simpsons Arcade. Each minigame is filled with voice samples, mostly from Bart, but we also have voice clips from Krusty, both in this minigame and in Dino Bar. Having voice acting is nothing new for Simpsons video games, and is arguably one of the features that made Simpsons games stand out among other licensed titles. Even the Imagineering games had voice clips. There weren't very many, but in Bart vs. the Space Mutants and Escape from Camp Deadly on the Game Boy, you can hear Bart speak.
Eat my shorts. Eat my shorts. I can lava.
It's usually only Bart who gets voice clips, but in Virtual Bart there are lots of different clips that you can hear in every minigame. Having a game where the characters talk all the time isn't necessarily a good thing, but for a 1994 SNES game, it's cool to hear all these different characters. Most of the voice clips sound correct, most likely because they're taken from the show, but Homer sounds very off. He almost sounds too wimpy?
Get out! Ooga, go. Ooga, go. Ooga, go.
Dan and Nancy are both in the credits, so I assume it's official voice work, so not sure why he sounds so off. The clips are normally taken from the show, but I don't recognize these Homer ones. Mount Splashmore is a simple minigame, as the only controls are moving left and right. It's about avoiding things, picking which pipe to go down, and going for items like health or a surfboard that makes you invincible for a bit. There's also a timer which you can increase by collecting clocks, and you lose time if you get hit by Blinky. We're on the 4th minigame now, so you shouldn't be too surprised to hear that this is quite difficult and pretty frustrating. To start with the first problem, it's more 2D trying to be 3D, and one of the ways they create that effect is by having the pipe you're going down be striped. It does a pretty good job of making it feel a bit more 3D, but it can be hard to look at. The patterns are moving quite fast, making part of the screen almost feel like it's flashing. It took me a bit of time to adjust to this and focus on the parts of the screen that are actually important. Another problem with the fake 3D is that you're avoiding things that are 2D that increase in size as they come towards you. It makes it hard to judge where things are going to be by the time you need to avoid them, and this is made worse by the fact that some enemies like Blinky do in fact move side to side when they appear. It takes a lot of practice to know how these sprites move towards you, as sometimes they are in one place and the sprite increasing in size is just the illusion that they're moving, and sometimes they're actually moving side to side. Not having any obstacles move side to side as they come towards you would have simplified this 3D effect and make it easier to understand. As is, there are times where it feels like things gravitate towards you, as something is in one part of the pipe, you move to get out of the way, only for them to move to where you went and hit you anyway, even though you did react to them. A bit of practice makes this easier to judge, but it's a flaw with this actually being 2D, and the design not properly taking this into account. One of the hardest parts of this minigame is making sure you go down the right pipe. When you encounter a crossroads, each pipe will either be green, blue, or pink-ish. Only one is the correct one, and to know which one that is, you need to look at the meter at the top of the screen. This meter shows your progress down the slide, with Blinky representing Bart. When you're approaching a split in the pipe, an icon will appear on the meter which will be the colour of the correct pipe. It means you need to keep an eye on the meter, and when you see a coloured icon appear, make a mental note of that colour and then pick the correct pipe when that appears. Sometimes you're given plenty of warning to be able to do this, but other times it can appear only a second or two before the pipes appear. In a second, you need to notice the icon appear, note the colour, look at the approaching pipes, figure out which direction you need to go in, and then move Bart so he goes down the right pipe. Everything is randomly generated in this minigame after the first set of pipes, so you can't simply memorise which direction you need to go. A minigame that tests your reaction time is pretty typical, but the windows to react are very strict, and you may not be able to move in time due to the controls. The controls are very loose to emulate Bart going down a water slide. When you go to one side, Bart swings more to that side rather than going exactly where you aim him. Bart is also affected by the turns in the pipe. He gets pushed around when there's a corner even if you don't press anything on the D-pad. This creates situations where you press left or right to move Bart, either to avoid something or get some much needed health, and then you try and move left and right again to pick the right pipe, but Bart won't get there in time. You may see that you needed to go down the pipe on the right, but you dodged left before they appear, so you just don't have enough time to get back to the right. The loose controls, hard to judge graphics, and very tight timing on the pipes meant that I hit another wall in Virtual Bart. Luckily, this is the shortest minigame so far, with a successful run only taking 3 minutes, so all my failed attempts took much less time. I was improving, getting a better sense of how to dodge things and figuring out how to best move Bart. In the end, I settled on trying to reduce how much I move Bart entirely, keeping him to the middle mostly and only going to the side as needed. This reduced how much Bart swung side to side, meaning I could pick the correct pipe more easily when they appeared. This still wasn't enough though, so I decided to give the strategy guide another read. There was a piece of advice in there which was the most useful thing I found in the whole guide. It recommended to pause the game as you slid down the pipe. When you pause, the game goes dark for a bit, but you can still see what's happening on screen. It means you can see things as they approach you and better judge how to move out of the way, and even better, see which pipe you need to go down. Using this trick, I was able to get much further in and eventually complete this minigame. It felt odd that a minigame like this would require such a trick. Virtual Bar has been very difficult so far, so I expected Mouth Splashmore to be hard, but the reaction times needed felt too tough, even for this terrible video game. I decided to try Mouth Splashmore again, but this time on actual hardware. I booted up my SNES and gave it a go. On my first attempt without using the pausing trick, I almost beat it, and after 2 more tries, I finished it. No pausing, just being able to properly react to what was being thrown at me and being able to pick the right pipe, rarely ever going down the wrong one. Some of this was practice. I was better at the minigame than when I started, but it felt more reasonable to complete, even with the same flaws being present. It's most likely because I was playing on the PAL version. I'm not confident enough on the technical side of things to explain this fully, but in short, PAL versions of SNES games run slower than NTSC ones. It means games run slower, so you have more time to react when on PAL. When this minigame gives you such short time frames to do stuff, the extra time, even if it's tiny, seems to be enough to make everything much more doable. I don't have an American SNES to compare this with, but I did find a European version of Virtual Bar online and I played that on an emulator. I got the same result on that as I did with my PAL SNES. It only took me 2 attempts to beat the emulated PAL version of the game. It seems to me that the slower PAL version makes this easier, but if anyone understands the more technical aspects of the SNES and has any ideas on this, please do let me know. Anyway, that's another minigame down, and in some ways it's the best one yet. I can't say I like it, but it's one of the more beatable minigames, and like the other minigames, looks pretty nice after you get over the stripes on the pipes. It's also a direct reference to the show, with it taking place in Mount Splashmore. It's arguably the only minigame that is a direct reference to the show, which is a missed opportunity when you have a whole game which is just one-off minigames. Even with these positives and having an easier time with the PAL version, I never enjoyed my time playing it. At best, it's okay, but Mode 7 graphics don't mix well with a fast-paced minigame with loose controls. It did only take me an hour to finish, including playing it on my PAL SNES. Maybe that's a sign things are looking up. We start with a truck pulling up and releasing pigs into a factory, all being watched by a clown, and the last pig off the truck is Bart. The level starts with you playing as this pig-Bart hybrid, and you're avoiding clowns and trying to free the other pigs who are locked up. We've gone off the deep end now with the concept of these mini-games. Mount Splashmore and Virtual Class Pitcher were very grounded with the show, and featured activities that Bart would do. Even Baby Bart ties in with Bart being a troublemaker from a very young age, something the show has mentioned and joked about multiple times. Dino Bart is a stretch, but with Bart's personality, I can kind of see Bart being a dinosaur, or at least Bart wanting to have that fantasy or experience. That doesn't give Dino Bart a pass, and I do think it's too abstract, but Pork Factory Pig Bart takes it to the next level. Why am I playing as Bart as a pig who's freeing other pigs? Pig Bart himself looks kind of creepy, and with this taking place in a meat processing plant that is run by clowns, this level is a bit unsettling. The idea of a kid experiencing what it's like to be turned into an animal and then having to escape being murdered while you're trying to save other pigs, and it's all being run by Krusty the Clown, Bart's hero, it's pretty dark when you think about it. I don't think there's any vegan agenda here, nothing like that. It reminds me more of dark kids films, where the hero is presented as quite powerless in a big scary world that they don't fully understand. I kind of like this for that reason and its overall strangeness, but I wish it was better connected to The Simpsons. There's no connection here, it's a weird standalone idea which feels weird for its own sake. Back in Bart's Nightmare, there was the Bartzilla minigame which was weird, but you can imagine Bart wanting to be Godzilla and cause destruction. It also had Bart climbing the Empire State Building to take on Homer as King Kong, which is a surprisingly nice metaphor for Bart's and Homer's relationship. Pork Factory Pig Bart is lacking that element, which makes it more shallow. I'm not looking for anything deep with the concept of these minigames, just some reason behind the weirdness to make it easier to enjoy and allow myself to get lost in it. There's literally been a Simpsons game with weirdness in the title, and that felt less weird and better connected to the show than Virtual Bart does. It is funny that this pork factory is run by Krusty though. It's a joke that the show also makes about Krusty being Jewish, but he still associates himself with pork products. That one joke might be the whole reason this level exists at all. Pork Factory Pig Bar is the final platforming level in Virtual Bar. It's a more traditional platforming level. It's closer to Dino Bar, but you're playing as a pig, so there are control changes. You can't attack, all you can do is move and jump, and if you hold up while jumping, it triggers a bounce, which is higher than the standard jump. There's no way to attack, so when you come across an enemy, which are all clowns, you can only jump on their heads. The first part of the minigame is going through this factory and freeing pigs who are locked up. There are some positives straight away compared to the other platforming levels. Nothing flies at you from off screen to do damage without enough warning, and there aren't as many enemies to deal with. The clowns are in fixed locations, and you can either take them out or avoid them. You're not taking damage frequently in this level, which is nice. There are instant kill pits and things that can kill you in one, but far less than in other levels. It's better when compared to the rest of Virtual Bar, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have its own problems. For whatever reason, they made a large amount of the platforms you have to jump on have an isometric perspective. They're at an angle, which means it's unclear what part of the platform you can stand on and which parts you can't. Instead of extending the platform collision out to reduce confusion, instead it takes some guesswork and you can fall through the platforms. It doesn't really matter if the isometric look makes the platforms look better, doing this makes the platforming worse and adds frustration when you miss, even if you did deserve to miss. Most of the factory is a maze, where you're going in and out of doors to try and find keys so you can rescue all the pigs in the area. The setup is more complicated than it needs to be. You need to pull a lever in order to make one of the 3 keys appear. The green one appears in front of the levers, but the other 2 are hidden. You can only have 1 key active at a time, so you pull the lever and then search everywhere for the key. You then have to go and use the key to rescue one of the pigs. These cages are also split around the area and you have to find those as well, and after you do that, you need to go back to activate another lever and then re-explore all the areas again to find the next key. You can only activate the lever by bouncing, and it's quite picky to where you have to bounce in order for it to work. It's both hard to do, but also somehow easy to accidentally turn a lever on and off. This is what I did when I first played the level, so I figured out about needing to use the levers to activate the keys, but I was turning the lever on and off again without realizing. If the light is off, then it means the key hasn't spawned. As this is a maze which requires a lot of going around in circles to figure out where to go and to memorize the layout, the levers makes this harder to figure out. It's unnecessary. I don't know why the key can't be active at the same time, so you're not going back and forth between the same areas. After you know where all the keys spawn, this is actually quite simple, but the process of figuring this out could have been smoothed out a lot. Once you free all the pigs in the area, a final key appears by the levers which allows you to use a lift to go to the next section. This section is inside a freezer. You don't need to worry about freeing any pigs or a maze here. It's a to-the-point platforming section where you're riding on moving platforms and jumping on frozen pigs to reach the top. It's pretty depressing to see an ice level again. It once again adds slippery physics, so you slide around when you move and jump. In a choice that I can only describe as cruel, even the platforms that don't have ice on them are slippery. These moving grates cause you to slide as well. There's no ice on them or anything to indicate this, they just have ice physics. A good counter to the ice physics is to continuously bounce rather than jump normally. It stops you from sliding if you bounce every time you land on the ground. I like the idea of this bounce. It gives you a choice to how you want to jump. The normal jump is quicker, but the bounce gives you more height. I wish the bounce wasn't used by holding up on the D-pad. It doesn't feel good having to hold up to keep bouncing while you're also moving your thumb to press left and right to aim yourself. If the bounce was on one of the face buttons that aren't being used, it would have felt much better. The awkwardness of the bouncing makes this ice section my least favourite part of the level. The bounce goes further than the jump, and most of these gaps require you to use the bounce, and even if you do use the bounce, you can still fall through the platforms. The ice physics actually aren't that much of a problem in the end, it's mostly trying to get the timing down when bouncing. If you fall, you're likely going into a pit and need to start again. The freezer is quite short, and overall Pork Factory Pig Bar is less harsh than the other platforming levels. None of the platforming is particularly interesting though. It has very standard elements like blocks appearing and disappearing, and moving platforms, which don't create an interesting challenge. The main problem with this level though is the bounce. The times I got frustrated with this level was when I was wrestling with the D-pad trying to bounce the way I wanted to. After you bounce off frozen pigs and jump along the top of the freezer, you enter a smaller frozen room. This isn't a platforming area, instead it's a one-off challenge where you need to push the frozen pigs from the left side of the room to the right side and then jump on a switch to launch them up. If you time that correctly, they're taken into the next room via this hook. You need to do this 5 times, while avoiding a clown that can't be killed who shoots liquid nitrogen at you. I can say it's nice to have something a bit different. It's not a complete gameplay shake-up like we saw in Baby Bart, but it's a way to break up the platforming which is welcome. I didn't enjoy this room at first, and it's all because of this clown. As you can't kill him, the best thing to do is avoid him, but there are times when he's standing right where the pigs are, so you can't push the frozen pigs without the clown getting to you. You can try and avoid the clown, but the only real way to do this is to understand the trick of how and why he moves. He doesn't move in a set pattern going left to right, but he does react to you in a not so logical way. If you go all the way to the left to get a frozen pig, he'll move to the right and give you some space. If you move all the way to the right, then he'll go to the left side instead. It's when you're in the middle is where he stays put, and will stay in one spot if you're close to him. It means you need to go to the left side to start pushing a pig, and when you reach the middle, jump over the clown using the frozen radiators and go all the way to the right to then force him to go left, to then go back to the middle to finish pushing the pig. It's pretty easy once you figure this out, but it's not logical enough to make it enjoyable to figure this out. This is ultimately a video game, so they need to make the enemies a bit stupid so you can beat them. But it's weird that instead of having the clown go back and forth in a fixed pattern like they're patrolling, the clown reacts to you in a way that no one ever would. It might sound like I'm nitpicking here, and I kind of am, but the lack of logic in the clown's movements makes this more annoying than it should be to figure out. After you've figured out how to get past the clown, it ends up just being a boring section where you're going back and forth 5 times doing the same thing. It's a common theme of this level. When the platforming is reasonable and you've got a good grasp of the controls and jumping, you're left with a level that's ultimately dull. It's not fun to pull levers to enable keys to free pigs to then enable other keys. It's not fun to bounce on slippery platforms, and it's not fun to push a frozen pig across a room 5 times. The level is full of different ideas, but none of these ideas are good and actually help create an enjoyable level to play. It's a thumbs up for the frozen pig section being quite easy though. I'll accept Virtual Bart's mercy even though I know it won't last long. After freeing 5 frozen pigs, you're teleported into the furnace. This is the final platforming section, and with this being fire themed, you would think it would be the most difficult, but it's kind of one of the easier parts of the level. You have to time your jumps on platforms that pop out of the wall and avoid these crushes. Towards the end, you have to jump on different types of platforms over a giant pot of fire while electric bolts are shot at you. This all sounds hard, and it is easy to slip off and die, so it's still a bit punishing, but the timing for all of this is oddly generous. At the start of the furnace, there are platforms that you can completely avoid by bouncing upwards, and the crushes look intimidating, but they don't do that much damage. I did game over here when learning the best route through the level, but once you know the way to go, there are no real difficult jumps. The most confusing part is at the end, where if you try and jump off the last platform onto the ledge, you'll die every time. Instead, all you need to do is walk off. It's harsh level design, as it's easy to get past this when you know what to do, but very punishing when you don't, and it's the last jump you need to do to get past the furnace. There's a pig you can save in here as well, but it's the first one that you don't actually need to save to progress. If you ignore it, nothing happens. I don't like the furnace because of the general issues that Pork Factory Pig Bart has with the jumping and it being quite boring, but I won't complain too much about a part of Virtual Bart being easy. Well, not really easy, just more doable. Escaping the furnace takes Pig Bart into a corridor, showing off crusty pork products on the wall, and then you're in a fancy office with 3 businessmen in suits. This is actually a proper boss fight, with 2 of the businessmen taking turns to attack you and the other one stomping up and down to knock books off a shelf that do damage. This is certainly a big tone shift, and I don't know what to make of all of this. It's something, but I feel numb to all of Virtual Bart's oddities at this point. I don't have any emotions left to react to it. It was surprising when I first got here, but it doesn't make me feel much of anything. This is potentially getting depressing, so let's talk about the boss fight itself. As Pig Bart can't attack, you instead have to try to use the attacks that the other businessmen do to make them attack each other. You have to try and sync up the books falling down so they land on the businessmen's heads, or sync up with the other businessmen throwing pens and hams. You're avoiding one at a time, so you can focus on lining them up and making sure they take damage. I never got that good of a feel for the timing here when playing in practice mode, and it turns out you don't have to. It only takes a few hits for each of them to die, and if you die during the boss fight, any businessmen you took out before don't respawn. It means that as long as you have one spare life when you get here, you can fumble your way through this boss. When there's only one person left, you have to bait them into stomping at you in order for books to land on their head. This is probably the easiest part of the fight. The guy's too slow to ever be a big threat. After that easy boss fight, all the businessmen are defeated, and you can go to the right and free the last of the captured pigs. The pigs come rushing out of the wall, and Bart becomes a hero of all pig kind. It's nice there was some type of plot to this level, but it still comes across as a bit pointless. It's unique seeing a pig version of Bart travel through a factory, a freezer, a furnace, and then take down guys in suits to save a load of pigs, but even with this ending, I still don't think it justifies its weirdness. My time with Pork Factory Pig Bart went from general confusion to annoyance to indifference. The concept may be strange, but that novelty wears off before the end, and once you've played this multiple times, it's hard to care that much about the setting. The annoyance came from the controls. Pig Bart's normal jump is weak, and the bouncing really doesn't feel good. Couple that with the unclear platform collision and instant kill pits, and learning this level isn't a fun experience. After you do learn it, it's the most beatable platforming level in Virtual Bart, so there is some credit to give for it not being as punishing as Dino Bart or Baby Bart. Saying that, too much of the level is dull to play. Once you remove the difficulty, you have something that is boring throughout. I don't hate this minigame, and Virtual Bart has far worse, but it proves that when you remove the punishing element from Virtual Bart, you're not left with anything all that remarkable. I think the idea of having a minigame collection like this and have 3 of the levels to be these long platforming levels was just a bad idea. It makes them all feel shallow and disconnected. Maybe an experienced dev who knew how to make fun platformers could make this work, but that's not what Sculptured Software seemed to be. At least that's it for the platforming levels. I'm more than ready to wrap this all up. Doomsday Bar falls right into the category of a short, fake 3D minigame. It's set in a Mad Max style world after Springfield has been nuked. You play as Bart on a motorbike, and the goal is to reach the end of the road while dodging obstacles and being attacked. The enemies are Kearney with a chain who comes up to you and whip you, Jimbo who stays in the front and throws bombs backwards, and Otto in a bus that tries to run you over. There's not much more here, you just need to survive to the end and make sure you get past each checkpoint before time running out. Despite this being a pretty simple idea, the minigame is a big mess. Attacks can be near impossible to avoid. Kearney in particular can be taken out, but once he's next to you, you're gonna take damage. You need to hit him at least twice, either with a kick when he's nearby, or a water balloon gun if he's in front of you. The water balloon gun is slow to fire, and it can be difficult to aim properly due to the graphics. Like all the other 3D minigames, you don't get a real sense of depth, and the scaling of the sprites as they move on the screen feels very off. They jump around more than they did in Mount Splashmore, and it all feeds into this chaotic feeling. It is impossible not to take damage, so beating this minigame comes down to taking out the enemies quick enough to reduce how much enemy you take and making sure you pick up the health that they drop. There's also a luck factor with the spawning. Everything spawns in randomly, so as the buses cause all the other enemies to disappear and are quite easy to avoid, you want as many buses as possible. There's a lack of anything interesting with the gameplay. I'm very much over the 3D presentation at this point, and when you put the graphics aside, it's a very basic and overly chaotic minigame. You don't get proper turns in the road like you would in a normal racing game, you're only going forward and just slightly going to the side. There are other roads that you can see, but you can't reach those, you have to stay on the road you start on. It's not that there is no skill, you can control your speed, and you can do that to line up your shots with the water balloon gun, and that is something you get better at over time. It's only 2 minutes long, so it's not offensively bad, but unless you really enjoy the aesthetic of a Mad Max version of Bart in a world where everything is purple oddly, this minigame feels like the most pointless one yet. It's shallow, messy, and ultimately forgettable. I feel very beaten down by Virtual Bart. Figuring out all 6 minigames took much longer than it should have done. Despite this, there is one more thing left to do, and that's actually to try and beat the game. All my time with the minigames have been in practice mode so far, so I could figure out how to beat each one. I never imagined it would take this much to beat each minigame at least once. At this stage, I have played Virtual Bart for over 12 hours. It's exhausting playing the same poorly designed, half-baked, unpleasant 6 minigames over and over again for that long. The only way that it might feel worth it, and maybe I can get some enjoyment out of Virtual Bart, is if reaching the credit screens is satisfying in some way. If I can do that and beat this overly difficult game, maybe it will be worth it. I'll be playing the game on the PAL version going forward to make Mouth Splash more easier. There isn't many differences with the PAL version. The only other one that I noticed were the frozen pig blocks in Pork Factory Pig Bar. In the US version, the pigs are pink, but in the PAL version, they're blue. Virtual Bart doesn't have the windy world like in Bart's Nightmare. Instead, you select the minigames by having Bart spin around in the VR machine and pressing a button to make him stop. Where Bart stops appears to be random, but you can pick which minigame you play by timing when you press a button. If you press a button when Bart's head is 2 spaces before the minigame you want to play, he'll stop on that minigame. So if you wanted to play Virtual Class Picture as an example, you'll want to press a button when Bart's head is around the Baby Bart minigame, so he spins around again and stops in front of the tomato. This is a trick that I read online, but I didn't find this method particularly consistent. When you first start a playthrough, this is very much the case, which means you can decide which minigame you play first every single time. After the first spin, sometimes the timing was the same, and sometimes it would either stop wherever you press the button, or it would stop 2 spaces behind. I was able to manipulate the system to get the minigame I wanted most of the time, but sometimes it would land somewhere different, so it doesn't feel like you can always time it. On the wheel there are 7 spots, with the top one not being a minigame. It's a space that goes between a corn dog and a skull. At the start of each playthrough you begin with 3 lives, and beating a minigame keeps all your lives, but if you lose a minigame then you also lose a life. If you land on this top space, if it's a corn dog then you're given an extra life. If it's a skull, then you lose a life instead. It jumps between the 2 images so fast that it's very hard to time it to get a corn dog every time to grind extra lives, so it's normally best to avoid it. It was quite exciting when I first started playing this game for real. Not because I was having fun with the game, but I was now putting together everything I learned in practice to get a real chance at beating this game. There was a light at the end of the tunnel. If I played well enough, then I could stop playing this terrible game. I didn't do so well to begin with, but after the first few attempts, the minigame started to separate into different categories. There were ones that I could do nearly every time, the ones that were more 50-50, and then there were the ones that I could rarely do. Surprisingly, Dino Bart and Pig Bart were the 2 minigames that I was able to beat every time. Pork Factory Pig Bart is more boring than hard, and Dino Bart was still irritating, but after practicing that level, I never failed at it again. It helps that they throw a lot of lives at you in that level, so individual deaths don't matter too much as you have plenty of chances. I was even able to avoid the bouncing acid boulders better, and I managed to ride the pterodactyls across the icy lake as well. A new problem emerged with Dino Bart though, and that is that it's very difficult to beat the ice section within the time limit you're given. Due to the fact the end boss has you riding a platform backwards and forwards, if you get to this section without dying, you have very little time to take out Moe and Homer. It's only possible, but you have to be a lot more aggressive, which wasn't something I was willing to do. What ended up happening is that I would take out Moe on the left side, run out of time and die, but then have to get back here to take out Homer. Most enemies in Dino Bart don't respawn even if you die, so you can get rid of Moe and he doesn't come back. Even after all this, Dino Bart is still filled with frustrating moments and it deserves to be in the Simpsons Video Game Hall of Shame, but it is beatable with practice. When playing the game properly and not using the practice mode, there are a few mechanics here to help you beat the game. If you die in a minigame and are returned to the Bart spinning screen, if you select the same minigame again, you start from a checkpoint rather than from the beginning. This is true for all the minigames but Doomsday Bart, which is the shortest minigame overall, so that doesn't need a checkpoint. It's even true for Mount Splashmore. If you fail and then start from the beginning of the slide, it counts as you as being right at the end. This can actually make it a bit harder as the time limit is also reduced, but it's still nice not having to play the whole minigame again. What's even nicer about Mount Splashmore is that it's possible to get a second chance within the minigame without losing a life. Normally if you pick the wrong pipe 3 times, you get a cutscene showing Bart being thrown out of the slide in a variety of different locations. One of these cutscenes shows Bart being eaten by a lion, but the lion spits Bart back out and the minigame continues from where you were. It was a surprise to see Virtual Bart show some mercy and was genuinely a nice little moment when it first happened. To get a unique cutscene like this and then be able to beat the minigame because of that extra chance, that's cool. I also figured out in Mount Splashmore that there is a way to help you know which pipe you need to go down. If you need to go down a pink pipe, that is always on the right, and the blue pipe is always on the left. It's only the green pipe that changes which side it's on, which makes it easier to know which direction you need to go. That would have been something nice to mention in the strategy guide, Steve, but oh well, I guess you can just include it in the 2030 edition. Another way that Virtual Bart shows mercy is with the corn dog and skull on the spinner. It normally jumps between the corn dog and the skull, but if you have 4 or more lives, it stays on the skull. If you only have 1 life left, then it permanently stays on the corn dog. It means the game always gives you a chance to get an extra life, so you don't have to go into a minigame knowing that if you fail that minigame, then it's game over. You can somewhat time the spinner, but that's not consistent, so the strategy becomes completing minigames to the left of the corn dog space. If Bart's head stops on a minigame space where the minigame has already been completed, he keeps spinning to the next active space. This means if you say complete Doomsday Bart, which is to the left of the top space, if Bart lands on Doomsday Bart again, he will keep going clockwise and land on the corn dog. My strategy became to always time it, so I always started a playthrough with Doomsday Bart. I would beat that, and then try to beat Mount Splashmore, and then try to beat Virtual Class Pitcher. Doing that means if Bart lands on 4 of the 7 spaces on the spinner, it'll count as him landing on the corn dog when I only have 1 life left. I mentioned before about some of the minigames I only had a 50-50 chance of beating them, and those 2 minigames are Doomsday Bart and Mount Splashmore. Neither are too hard, on the PAL version at least, but because they're short, it's also easy to fail them. As they're both short and can be easy to lose, and Dino Bart and Pork Factory Pig Bart are long and can be beaten, it didn't make sense to play Dino Bart or Pork Factory Pig Bart early on. If I spent 30 minutes beating one of the platforming levels only to fail one of the harder shorter minigames, then beating those games was a waste of time, and it also doesn't help me get extra lives on the spinner. Virtual Class Pitcher can be difficult as well, but with some more practice I was able to beat the egg part more consistently. I was never great at it, but I became more likely to beat it as time went on. Plenty of runs failed due to losing at Virtual Class Pitcher, Mount Splashmore or Doomsday Bart, but there's one minigame I haven't talked about yet, and that's Baby Bart. Baby Bart is the hardest level by a country mile, and it's all because of the seal ball section in the second half of that minigame. The technical understanding that you need in order to beat this section consistently goes far beyond what a minigame collection based on The Simpsons should ever require. It all comes down to the fact that the seals' timings are not consistent. They didn't create a specific challenge for the player to complete, they set up a long row of seals, each with their own timings of going up and down, and then they force the player to react to whatever those timings ends up being over an instant kill death pit with very tight jumps and small time windows to decide what to do. It's not enough to be able to beat this once. This is a non-linear game where you might be able to get through this, but a game over elsewhere and you need to do it all over again. My run started to come to an end specifically because of this section. I would have a good run, clear out most of the other minigames, and then would have Baby Bart left to do. I would get stuck in a cycle between playing Baby Bart, failing at it, stopping the spinner to get an extra life, trying Baby Bart again, loading into the seal section only to fail it once more. It loads you back at the seal ball section when retrying Baby Bart for a second time, which is useful, but this loop is maddening. I would eventually reach a game over whenever I guessed the timing of the spinner wrong, and it would go into Baby Bart when I didn't want it to, as I would only have 1 life left. Baby Bart really exposes how bad this type of structure and setup is for a minigame collection that's this difficult. It only takes one section to stop you from beating the game. You may say that's true for linear video games as well. If you get stuck on a boss in a game, then you're stuck and you can't see the rest of the game. The difference between Virtual Bart and a linear game is that in a linear game, your reward for beating a difficult section is to see more of the game. You beat a boss and then you get to go to the new area or new set of levels, so get to experience new parts of the game, which is exciting. In Virtual Bart, you've seen everything. The game has nothing to show you that's interesting. You can see it all in practice mode, And even if you don't use practice mode and play it normally, you will see all the different minigames after an hour or so. Yes, it feels good to beat a minigame for the first time, but after that first time, it doesn't matter anymore unless you can beat all the minigames in one playthrough. I'm not sure if I could quite say this structure is broken, and it does kind of create this ultimate challenge factor to beating this game, but if the goal was to ensure people enjoyed their time with Virtual Bar, this wasn't the way to do it. After 6 hours of full attempts, I decided to go back to practice mode in order to figure out how to properly beat Baby Bart more consistently. I never got good at it, but there are a couple of things you can do here to make it more doable. The first is the diaper chute. The diaper chute gives you an extra half a second before you land on the fence, and that can make all the difference. It unfortunately doesn't work very well, as there's a delay to when Bart starts using it after you hit the button. You can't press it at any time in a jump to get extra airtime, you have to start pressing it during the first half of the jump to ensure it activates in time to make it useful. It can also cause you to overshoot your jump, so you need to be careful with that. The second tip is that you need to come up with a specific path and timing to get past the balls. I found if I jumped across the first balls normally, then most of the time the fourth and the fifth ball would be in sync in a way that would make it very hard to land on the fifth ball. If you jump a little bit early for the first jump, then jumping to the fifth ball becomes much easier. The randomness of the timing between each seal seems to be based on when the seal loads in. So if you have one seal coming up and down, whenever you reach an earlier seal, it will decide when the next seal loads in, creating the timing between the next two seals. It's oddly technical, and also requires trial and error in order to see how the seals will sync up based on everything you've done up to that point. It's insane. I ended up creating a route for the beginning bit and then hoping for the best. That involved doing the first jump normally, not too early, just right, so the fourth and the fifth ones were unfairly synced, and then jumping back to the second seal and then back to the fourth seal so I could easily jump across the fifth. Doing that would give me pretty good timings for the rest of the balls as long as I used the diaper chute and didn't get too impatient. This route didn't always work out in my favour, but it at least gave me a fighting chance to beat this. After some more practice with Baby Bart, the only thing left to do is actually beat the game. It takes the precision, skills and patience of a speedrunner to beat Virtual Bar, and even that might be too generous. There isn't a single speedrun of Virtual Bar submitted to speedrun.com for the SNES version. There's 2 for the Genesis, but nothing for Super Nintendo. After a few more attempts, with most of them ending with me dying on Baby Bart, I had a run where there was a chance. I beat Dino Bart first, and Baby Bart came up second. All the stars aligned and I was able to get past the seals. The crazy thing is that the seals aren't the end of the level, you still have to complete a pretty difficult section inside the circus. It was touch and go and I lost a lot of lives trying to swing across, in part due to how awful the hit detection was on the trapezes, but with 0 life remaining, I reached the cannon and Baby Bart was done. Virtual Class Pitcher came next, which is the second hardest minigame for me, but I was able to land some nice shots and that was also done. The 2 hardest minigames was completed and I had 3 lives left to beat the rest. Things started falling apart with Pork Factory Pig Bar. I kept falling through one of the platforms in the furnace and eventually failed the minigame completely for the first time ever. To rub salt in the wound, I then landed on the top space and lost another life instantly. After having 3 lives and was on top of the world, I now only had 1 life, so it was now do or die, and I couldn't rely on landing on the top space again due to not beating Doomsday Bar. I got back to Pork Factory Pig Bar and was able to take care of business. I really wanted that corn dog on the spinner, but I couldn't guess the correct timing, so instead I went to Mount Splashmore. It's so easy for things to go wrong in Mount Splashmore. It's so easy to take a lot of damage and to miss the health pickups, and it's so easy to run out of time by going into all the blinky fishes that charge at you. I'm not sure what happened, but I was able to pick up a large number of clocks so I didn't run out of time, and I didn't go down the wrong pipe once. I got hit a lot at the end, but I was barely able to survive with a sliver of health. This left only Doomsday Bar, a minigame that is more on the easy side, but you can still take a lot of damage quickly, and if you don't get those health pickups, you die. I played cautiously to try and stay alive, and with one last nitro boost, I was across the line and the game was done. I made some very strange noises after doing this, which I won't be able to recreate for this video. It felt pretty amazing to finally beat Virtual Bar. It took me 19.5 hours to get to this point. Most of that time, I was pretty miserable. To no longer to have to keep playing and grinding out this game, it was an amazing feeling. This feeling doesn't justify everything that came before. I'm proud I can say I beat Virtual Bart without cheating, but it is very much for the wrong reasons. It's like if you were able to punch down a brick wall by just punching it. At the end it would be nice to say you knocked down a wall with your bare hands, but that doesn't stop it from being a stupid thing to do, and you've probably hurt yourself pretty badly in the process. Virtual Bart ends with you going back to the spinner one last time, showing Bart being let out of the machine. Homer decides to jump in and he starts spinning around. He keeps spinning faster and faster until the game fades to black, taking us to the credits. The credits are similar to the ones in Bart's Nightmare, although they don't have all the different characters going across the screen, so it's a bit more standard. For what it takes to finish Virtual Bart, it's hard not to expect a little more from the ending. One very brief cutscene showing Homer in the machine and a boring credits scene doesn't cut it. When one of Virtual Bart's strengths has been its presentation, this needed to be better. I've been quite harsh on the endings of these Simpsons games so far, but it's because they all feel a bit lazy. There doesn't need to be much to the end of these games. I think Bart vs. the Space Mutants did a good job, as well as Escape from Camp Deadly. Seeing original artwork of The Simpsons is a big reason to play these games, so I just want a bit more of that. Virtual Bart created original images with basic animations for each minigame, so a unique one of those would have been enough. I don't have much more to add for Virtual Bart. You have a score throughout each playthrough, and after beating the game it does present you with your final score. A high score seems pretty pointless for an SNES game, but it's even more pointless here because there's no leaderboard. There's nothing to compare it to. If you want to try and beat your score, you have to write it down yourself. You can't even prove you got this score unless you take a photo of your TV in the limited time that your score is on screen. There's no replay value in Virtual Bart, but maybe that's a good thing. Virtual Bart is a joyless video game. It feels like a game that was designed without any consideration to whether players would enjoy their time with it. It's almost a demonstration of what happens when someone makes a game without trying to make it fun. Any half-decent ideas are trampled with the game's obsession with punishing the player, to throw anything and everything at the player, to suck all enjoyment out of any of the ideas that could have been something interesting. This game can be mastered. You can learn each minigame bit by bit and put that all together to beat it, but it never stops being frustrating to play. It's a soulless version of Bart's Nightmare. It strips back what made that game enjoyable to leave an irritating mess. The most positive aspect of Virtual Bart is the presentation. It's a game that feels the most like The Simpsons so far. The artwork is mostly correct, and some of the minigames feel very faithful to the show. The other minigames though, it's like they wanted to make a Treehouse of Horror game, but instead were forced to use this VR concept. This might have worked better as a Treehouse of Horror game, but because it isn't one of those, it creates a bit of a disconnect. That makes it a weak Simpsons game, giving Virtual Bart next to no value as a video game as a whole. Virtual Bart is the worst video game I have ever played, or at least the worst video game I've ever beaten. I'm shocked that it's not mentioned in the list of the worst games of all time. I've played games like Balan Wonderworld, Sonic 06 and Alien Colonial Marines. I would much rather play those games than Virtual Bart. Virtual Bart isn't buggy or unfinished, it's just designed by the meanest video game developers to ever exist. I know someone on YouTube saying a game is the worst game of all time probably doesn't mean that much due to how exaggerated content has become on YouTube. You can find videos of people talking about how awful Super Mario Sunshine is, for example. The term the worst game ever has been devalued, but at least believe me when I say that I hate Virtual Bart, and it fails as a video game across the board. For ranking Virtual Bart, there's only one place it can go, and that's last. We've seen a lot of bad Simpsons games in this series so far, but Virtual Bart is on its own level. If you want this idea done much better, play Bart's Nightmare. And if you're curious about 90s Simpsons games and don't mind playing the bad ones, there's plenty of other games that are more worth your time than this. Go play Bart's House of Weirdness instead. With Virtual Bart being a third-party game on the SNES, it also released on the Genesis and Mega Drive. I couldn't find any concrete info on the release date of the Genesis version, but it seemed to come out around the same time. Virtual Bart on the SNES came out in September 1994, and the Genesis version seemed to release after that, but before Christmas 1994. This is going by the magazine reviews at the time, that stated that the game was now out back in November 1994. There's not much else to add about this port, so let's just jump straight into it. At face value, the Genesis version of Virtual Bart is the same game. Same premise of Bart getting stuck in a VR machine, with the same 6 minigames to play through. The spinner is back, although looks a bit different, and there's no major changes in content. There are differences though, so let's go through each of the 6 minigames, look at all the differences, and decide if the SNES or Genesis versions of each minigame is better. Starting with Dino Bar, the movement is roughly the same, although moving is a bit more sensitive, which caused me to die more often on the ice sections. It's not that it's bad, I just had to adjust. Oddly, they removed the higher jump in Dino Bar. On the SNES, you could hold up and press jump to do a slightly higher jump, but that's no longer an option. The Genesis doesn't increase the jump height from what I can tell, so while the higher jump was weird on the SNES, it does feel a bit lesser not being able to do that jump anymore. The level was rebalanced and tweaked across the board, with most of the changes making things easier. All of the platforms that used to crumble when standing on them no longer do, meaning you can take your time on some of the harder platforming sections. They didn't change the look of the platforms, so they still look like they're going to break, they just never do. The enemies now have less health, so you don't have to bounce on the cavemen for as long. Tail whipping is also quicker, so you can attack more often. This faster tail whipping makes the boss at the end much easier. The green dinosaurs also now get squished in one bounce with a new animation, which is nice. The acid drops don't last as long as before, so are easier to dodge, and the bouncing rocks don't do as much damage. The lava platforms that used to go up and down and sink when you land on them now stay in place, making them regular platforms. The timing on the moving ice platforms is a bit nicer as well. They don't snap away from you at just the wrong time like they did on the SNES. They didn't only make changes to make it easier though, they also made some changes which makes things harder. As previously mentioned, there's no extended jump, but they also give you far less lives overall. About half of the lives that you could find have been removed, and that's in part because most of the cavemen no longer drop any health or items like they used to. The boulders feel much more aggressive in this version, like when you're climbing up in the caves, they come charging right at you, rather than bouncing from side to side like before. The boulders also have some of the worst sound effects I've heard in a game. It's really distorted and crunchy in a way that's awful to listen to. After adjusting to the changes, I was able to beat Dino Bar on my second attempt. I'll say Dino Bar is slightly better on the Genesis. It's still difficult and irritating at times, but a bit of a smoother ride with less chances to be instantly killed. The hardest and more annoying parts have been smoothed out a bit, which is appreciated. Going clockwise around the spinner, next up is Baby Bart, the hardest level in the SNES version. Baby Bart on the Genesis at first feels insane. It feels a bit faster, with Bart feeling much more loose and everything moving a bit quicker. Bart now spins much quicker and the squibbles run all over the place. The baby music is present again, and they took an already ear-grating song and somehow made it worse. This section is quite difficult, and some of that is the loose controls, but it's also because Bart doesn't gravitate towards branches anymore. The auto aim is gone, so you can't focus on timing your swings knowing you'll stick to the next branch. Bart is now more likely to simply not grab onto a branch at all. This all has a much more chaotic feeling to it, and it can lead to a lot of deaths. You can't approach the Genesis version as the same way as you could on the SNES. Instead, it's all about getting as high as you can and floating across using the diaper chute. In the SNES version, the diaper chute was slow to come out and only lasted a second or two. On the Genesis, it lasts until you land, so you can float over a decent distance and skip a lot of the branch swinging. If you were forced to do the branch swinging, this would be much worse, but using the diaper chute, it's not too bad, and it can be quicker overall. The washing line bit has a different feel to it, where before it was more of an auto-scroller, now you can go at your own pace. There's a new toy plane enemy that's not too hard to avoid, and obstacles do a bit less damage now. On the flip side of this, the invincibility flames have been massively reduced. Virtual Bart isn't that generous with invincibility frames across the minigames, but in the Genesis version of Baby Bart, they're basically non-existent, so enemies can drain your health very quickly. It's a weird change to make. It makes getting hit more annoying to deal with. It's an awful feeling to lose so much health to one enemy. The balloon section is largely the same. The dogs jump up and down a bit differently, and there's a few toy planes to avoid. You can control the balloons a bit more too. You can slow them down if you want to help you avoid the dogs. The pram race has seen one big change that makes it harder. The time limit has been reduced. On the SNES, you could slow yourself down and focus on dodging everything to stay alive to get to the end. On the Genesis, if you do that, you will run out of time and die. It means you have to travel faster, which moves you more to the middle of the screen, which gives you less time to react to what's coming at you. It's easy to get hit here, there is so much rubbish in the street that you have to avoid, and the slight isometric view doesn't help. This is all about finding the right speed to go at. You don't want to go too fast as you'll hit too many obstacles, but if you go too slow then you'll run out of time. Once you find the sweet spot about how fast to go, it's okay to get through. This is worse than on the SNES, but there's far worse sections in this game. That takes us up to the seal ball bouncing, which has been completely reworked. Instead of precise platforming with insane timing, you're now bouncing off the balls that the seals hold up. You then use the diaper chute to float between them, and this is now pretty easy to do. You can bounce on one ball multiple times and wait for the next seal to be ready, and then nicely float across. It's amazing how much nicer this section is. You can also go underneath the fence a little bit more without dying, as they've lowered the kill zone. Improving the most difficult and unfair part of the game is a big win for the Genesis version. This takes us to the last section in the circus. The checkpointing here is much stricter than before. The checkpoints are quite generous on the SNES, but that was needed due to the high difficulty. To make up for having less checkpoints on the Genesis, lives now respawn every time you die. It means for this first section in the circus, if you die, you can keep collecting an extra life on the left to avoid a game over. With the improved diaper chute and Bart being able to swing higher, most of the circus is easier. It only becomes harder when it comes to the trapeze swings. They decided to make the timing of the jumps consistent this time, which is good, but the camera now would follow Bart as he swings back and forth. On the SNES, the camera stays in place, so you can always see where the next trapeze is going to appear. By following Bart instead, you now have to try and time your jump with the camera scrolling back and forth, and it makes it harder to judge properly. Because it's now consistent, you can practice the timing, but this worked better on the SNES. Because of the swinging, the circus is now the hardest part of the entire game. It doesn't reach the same level of difficulty as the seals on the SNES, but the timing is tricky, and if you miss a jump, you die. This part is where I got the most stuck. It took a lot of attempts until I was able to swing across successfully. You don't actually have to swing across all of them. Thanks to the diaper chute, once you've gone far enough, you can float to the next section. This doesn't always work, but it's worth trying if you miss a jump just in case you can make it. Despite the horrible music, the timer in the pram race, the lack of invincibility frames, and the circus being harder, the Genesis version of Baby Bart ends up being better. Swinging does feel worse, but improving the seal section and making the diaper chute last forever makes a world of difference. It's still the hardest minigame in Virtual Bar, but doesn't feel as impossible anymore. The last platforming level is Pork Factory Pig Bar, and it remains the easiest platforming stage on the Genesis. The general approach when bringing Virtual Bar to the Genesis was to rebalance it across the board, so they made the harder parts not as hard, but they also made the easiest parts a bit harder. Pork Factory Pig Bart's biggest change is with the controls. You can still only move, jump and bounce, but they added an acceleration and momentum to the movement that wasn't there on the SNES. It means it takes a second for Pig Bart to react when you're pressing the D-pad as he accelerates up to his normal walking speed, and when you stop moving, Pig Bart now slides before stopping. This only makes the controls worse. This isn't a momentum-based platformer that uses different speeds to create different ways to interact with the levels. It's a basic, uninspired level, so all you're adding here is delayed controls and making the player have to deal with ice physics across the whole minigame. It's not so bad that it breaks the level, it's just a bizarre change that makes playing this version a bit more annoying. Speaking of annoying, they added in new sound clips for Pork Factory Pig Bar, so now Bart is oinking like a pig the entire time. Other changes to this level include it now being easier to take shortcuts in the freezer by bouncing at the right time, and the clown when you're saving the pigs now has a more basic patrol pattern, so he only goes back and forth so you don't need to manipulate his AI to beat him anymore. He also fires his freezer gun thing less often, making it harder for him to kill you. This section is still quite boring, made more boring by the crane at the top taking longer to appear each time. I also had a bug in the key maze part at the beginning, where I rescued the 3 pigs but the yellow key didn't appear. I might have guessed that they moved the yellow key location in the Genesis version, but this was the second time I had played the level, so I knew it spawned in the same spot. After running out of time and dying, the key then appeared in the correct spot, so it seems like a bug. This happened to me more than once, so the key spawning is a bit broken. The furnace is a bit harder, as there's a new animation when you get hit by the fire shooting out of the walls, which freezes Pig Bart in place. The boss at the end is harder as well. Their attacks are all the same, but now they have more health, so take longer to defeat. The changes in Pork Factory Pig Bart don't make it overly difficult, but it's disappointing to see them even try to make it more difficult in the first place in these artificial ways. With the slippery new movement, that's enough to make this version noticeably worse. It's still beatable, but they took a dull level and made it a bit harder and ended up with a slightly harder dull level. Virtual Class Pitcher is the level that takes the biggest hit on the Genesis. The Genesis couldn't really do the same Mode 7 graphics that you would see on the SNES, so it means for Virtual Bar they had to try and fake it the best they could. This means we have a fake version of an already fake 3D level, and the lack of depth is very apparent. The size of the sprites is more consistent here, but it's much harder to judge where you need to throw a tomato to hit one of the kids. It doesn't help with the controls, so they added in an extra delay. It takes more time to start aiming your shot, which makes this a bit more tricky. The tomato level also uses a solid green colour for the grass, so there's less visual reference points for where your tomato is landing. On top of all of this, the kids now change how far away they are, so once they go off screen, the next time they move across the screen, they will be at a different depth. And to keep this fun ride going, they also change the diagonal throws to make them more difficult. On the SNES, when you hold left or right and press throw, you throw to the furthest point that one of the children can get to. On the Genesis version, the diagonal throws now only go halfway to the side, rather than the furthest point. On the SNES, you could get some of the more satisfying throws by timing your throws to when the kids are about to turn around, but that element's completely gone here. As there's no point of visual reference, you have to try and judge where the diagonal throw is going to land, and hope that you can sync that up to when the kid happens to walk across. This minigame is similar to Pork Factory Pig Bar. It was one of the easiest part of the game, so they decided to make it harder. They did it in the worst possible way though. It was already going to be harder due to the 3D effect not working as well, so they didn't need to make these other difficulty changes. This was the minigame that came the closest to being quite fun on the SNES, and they ended up killing that. It doesn't come close to the satisfaction and fun that you could have before. It's awful. It feels terrible trying to land these shots. The end result of all of this is depressing. This is a depressing minigame. It's translating a minigame onto hardware that couldn't really handle it, while also making it harder from a design perspective. If it wasn't obvious from the SNES version, the developers of Virtual Bar really are villains. I can't explain some of these choices any other way. To step back a bit and try and be fair, some of the problems I had was because of my muscle memory from the SNES version. After a bit of practice and adjustment, I was able to tap into the timing a bit better, and I was able to complete this minigame. If we stick to being positive for a second, for the egg level they made that easier. The kids don't move as fast, and they don't move at such awkward angles towards and away from the screen. What they did with this minigame overall is make the tomato level harder and make the egg level easier to smooth out the difficulty. For the egg level, that's appreciated, but the minigame ends up being less enjoyable to play. It's now pretty bad. It's ugly and controls worse, so the Genesis version ends up being the lesser version of this minigame. Mount Splashmore does a much better job of recreating the 3D effect from the SNES version. Quite a lot has been tweaked here, the main thing being how you tell which pipe you need to go down. Instead of looking at a coloured arrow on the meter at the top, instead there is always a man in front of the two pipes. On this man's back, the side that has all the white lines is the direction you need to go in. It's much more abstract as a concept, which makes it harder to notice, but it does mean you no longer have to keep looking up at the top of the screen. On the SNES, this minigame was all about staying alive and not running out of time, but on the Genesis, the minigame is much shorter and there's much less things to avoid. When something appears on screen, it stays there much longer. They're not necessarily easier to avoid due to the way they move side to side, but it does mean there's much less of them. The minigame is about a minute shorter, so you're more likely to fail due to picking the wrong pipes. Luckily, the pause trick works here too, which is how I ended up beating it. While playing Mount Splashmore on the Genesis, I noticed that one of the sprites was actually Matt Groening. He appears in the opening cutscene for the minigame, but he's one of the people on the slide as well. He's there on the SNES in the slide too, but they move so fast it was hard to tell. I thought it was Martin Prince, to be honest. One of the more odd changes to Mount Splashmore is that now you have to pick up items by pressing C rather than just going into them. There are now beach balls you can pick up and throw as an attack. The odd part is that C also allows you to duck underwater briefly, which isn't too helpful for dodging things as it doesn't last too long, but it also means that if you press C at the wrong time, you duck under items rather than picking them up. I struggled to pick up any items because of this. It's weird they didn't have the pick up item and duck underwater on two separate buttons. This minigame continues the trend of having awful audio for the Genesis. There's a loud squeak that plays whenever you slide to the side of the pipe. Ignoring this annoying squeaking, Mount Splashmore on the Genesis is a little bit better than the SNES one. It's mostly because it's shorter. There are slight changes to the mechanics, but it doesn't really fix any of the core problems. It's still too fast, the controls are still too loose, and it lacks the depth needed to make this idea work. It's a more beatable version of a not great minigame. Doomsday Bar is the minigame that has been reworked the most. You're still driving forward, avoiding rocks and taking out bullies as you pass through checkpoints to get to the end. Graphics of the environment have been completely redone, replacing the purple world for a more realistic grey road surrounded by brown dead earth. For the Genesis, they reworked the gameplay so it's more focused on the driving aspect. You have proper acceleration now, so it takes more time to reach your max speed. There are also bumps and dips in the road that can launch you slightly. The minigame is much longer. Your time is extended for every checkpoint you get past, but the distance between the checkpoints is much bigger. It takes about 2 minutes to beat on the SNES, but on the Genesis it takes around 6 minutes. Doesn't sound like much, but the SNES version is a short, chaotic minigame where you're just trying to survive the onslaught. On the Genesis, rather than spamming enemies at you, it's more about one-on-one encounters with the bullies, as it's focused on driving rather than combat. It does make this feel like a more complete minigame. There's no new mechanics really, but it feels a bit more fleshed out due to this rebalancing. The driving controls are a bit too sensitive to have this minigame be on the same level as something like Road Rash, which this is trying to emulate. Dodging all the stuff on the road feels a bit much, especially towards the second half with all the rocks and skulls. The most difficult part of the minigame is dealing with the buses. The road is smaller, so you have less room to get out of the way, and the buses hone towards you, making them harder to dodge. There's now health pickups on the road, and the time limit is quite generous, so whether you beat this minigame or not comes down to how well you can dodge all the buses. The longer length makes this minigame a bit dull, as the driving isn't fun enough to keep things interesting, and the buses honing in towards you with little warning creates frustrating moments. The Genesis version is still better overall, it feels more complete, and I think the visuals are nicer. I find it boring more than anything, but at least it's better developed as a concept. So that's all 6 minigames. All of them have been updated and there's been clear rebalancing across the board. It's great that they made some of the hardest parts of Virtual Bar easier, but they also decided to make the easy parts more difficult. It creates a more consistent difficulty, which is better, but that difficulty is still quite high. It probably is easier overall just because the difficulty spikes aren't as bad, but it's more difficult elsewhere. This makes the game more of a chore to play. It can still be frustrating, but I mostly came away from the Genesis version bored. The changes don't make it fun. It exposes how uninteresting the game is from a gameplay and level design perspective, while still being overly hard. 4 of the minigames I would say are better on the Genesis, with the other 2 being better on the SNES. The music is simply horrible on the Genesis as well. I've played a few clips and I hope that demonstrates how bad the audio is. It's one of the worst soundtracks in video games. It's a butchered version of an already bad soundtrack. It took a while to adjust to the changes across all the minigames, but after I did, I was able to beat this version as well. Part of the reason for that is because the spinner is much more consistent on the Genesis. The trick of pressing a button 2 spaces before the one you want to land on works most of the time. It means when I got stuck on Baby Bar at the circus, it was easy to keep getting extra lives after I failed. As I could keep avoiding getting a proper game over, it was only a matter of time before I finished the game. The game ends with the same cutscene of Homer getting into the VR machine, but for the credits, the background has been changed to the Virtual Bar logo. Ultimately, the Genesis version is better overall. The music is somehow worse, and Pork Factory Pig Bar and Virtual Class Picture are a step back, but the smoothed out difficulty does make it easier to get through. The rebalancing doesn't stop it from being a miserable experience, but it's a case of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I'm going to put the Genesis version higher than the SNES one, and 1 spot higher than Bar vs. the Space Mutants for the Genesis and Mega Drive. Virtual Bar is still worse than something like Bar vs. the Juggernauts, so the question I had to ask myself was, if there was a Simpsons fan who loved the Mega Drive or Genesis and had never played a Simpsons game before, would they be better off with Bar vs. the Space Mutants or Virtual Bar? Both are bad games and both are very frustrating to beat. If you have the patience to not just throw them in the bin after 30 minutes, then I think Virtual Bar would be the better choice. It's a weak minigame collection, but having different minigames does give it better variety, and there are more Simpsons characters in Virtual Bar. That's enough to edge Barfest of the Space Mutants out, which is a weak port of a poorly made 1991 NES platformer. The question I find myself after playing Virtual Bar is why is the SNES version of Virtual Bar not more widely disliked? From reading comments online, people don't like this game, but Virtual Bar to me feels like it's on another level of bad. It should at least be on some of the list for the worst games of all time, but it isn't looked at in that way. The Simpsons Skateboarding and The Simpsons Wrestling get mentioned in the worst games list, but Virtual Bar has avoided that label. I think there's a few reasons for this. One, Virtual Bar is a sequel to Bart's Nightmare, which is a much better known game. Bart's Nightmare isn't considered great, and games like Barfest of the Space Mutants are also quite notorious for being bad, so Virtual Bar gets overshadowed by them. They may be better games technically, but they are much better known and still considered to be bad. Virtual Bar also came out in 1994, which was a weird time in gaming, with the new 3D consoles on the way, and I don't think people cared as much about licensed games like this as much. Virtual Bar also isn't buggy in the same way that other notoriously bad games are. It's mostly functional, it's just very misguided and very poorly thought out with its difficulty. Bugs are a very obvious indicator of a rushed, incomplete game, and Virtual Bar doesn't have that element to it. When it comes to the worst games of all time, it's not about the quality of the game necessarily, it's about how spectacularly it fails. People have to be interested in the game in some way so it pulls in enough attention to be considered as one of the worst, and Virtual Bar lacks that pull. For me, it's a horrible video game, and I would be shocked if The Simpsons Skateboarding is somehow worse, but for most people, it's just another bad Simpsons game in a long line of bad Simpsons games. There's not enough about it to make it worthwhile remembering for most people. I guess Simpsons video games have a low enough reputation and enough damage has been done to the franchise without people needing to care about Virtual Bar. And that's Virtual Bar added to the list. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this look at Virtual Bar, please consider giving this video a like or leaving a comment below. I'll see you next time for Itchy and Scratchy Miniature Golf Madness. It's a bit weird that the next game is Itchy and Scratchy themed, but after Virtual Bar, maybe a nice simple Game Boy game is just what the doctor ordered.